Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the Architectural Bestia Symposium organized by us, SCI-Arc. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and to be with this fantastic group of panelists that are going to be populating the different sessions. Let me tell you a little bit of the background about the purpose of what is right now this online virtual exhibition. Originally, first was part of the Orleans Architecture Biennale, also known formally as Archilab, in 2019. When we were invited to be part of this, the thinking was to collaborate with Rehm, who designed the exhibition, to bring some of our group of full-time faculty and visiting faculty in the school. That they have an extraordinary imagination and they operate in multiple territories in contemporary design, using with different approaches technology and all the technology is available, and to speculate about what was the role of technology and the relation with authorship and the idea of machine learning and artificial intelligence, and also what I would argue with sampling and creating layers of commonality and differentiation, and what this perpetual mechanism of self-taught design can be fueled. So in this version of Bestia, originally known as Architectural Beast, now it's Architectural Bestia, this second iteration, and there will be more. So the idea that this is an ongoing process, that it may take a form of a prophecy maybe. So the notion is how we put in intersection individual authorships or partnership authorships and a kind of a larger collective that in technology intersects, and the way that we all mediate all the things of information, and how there is an individual and a collective memory that start to produce echoes and dialogue, some of them by friction, some of them by empathy. But the idea is, again, to speculate around all of this. So in a way, the exhibition doesn't try to provide any particular answer. It's more an opportunity for each of us to go deeper. And as I said, all the people that are part of the exhibition represent incredibly innovative way to think about architecture and design with the use of technology, and to also accept the mechanism of images as one of the main vehicles for the production, and how this can be in a permanent state of mutation. So what we're trying to do today with this symposium is to have a series of panels with different group of people to discuss some of the subjects. Each of the panels will have micro topics under the umbrella of what the show is. The virtual show is officially open and is available, and it will keep, as I said, changing and updating. It will take other versions and iterations. So if you're interested, stay tuned, register, because you can see the evolution of it. And this is something that we aspire to keep inviting more people, and also to keep updating and changing the work in this kind of a kaleidoscope of blending of concepts from different angles and different points of view. So without further ado, let me pass the screen to Rehm, that he will go a little bit more into details and a little bit of the background and behind this, or what is displayed here. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope that everybody enjoyed the different conversation. This is something that we are very much looking forward to keep fueling the discussion as we move forward. Thank you very much. Casey, your turn.
Thank you, Hernán. I'm also joined tonight by Anthony Tran, who led the web development of the exhibition, and we're going to kind of walk you through some of the concepts, ideas behind the design to kick off the conversation this evening. As Hernán said, the Architectural Beast began as a show at CRAC for the Biennale a few years ago. And the show consisted of this kind of series of double glasses where each artist that was part of the exhibition contributed like a still image. And then paired with that still image was a kind of representative media sequence that was evolved by the machine over the course of the show. The kind of video content neural net stack produced were things like this, where we show over the course of the video what's called a latent walk through the learned features and learned aesthetics from the image generating network. And additionally, the network contains a kind of image description and a second larger text generating network, where we wanted the architectural beast to begin to think about how to represent the work or discuss the work it was producing through multiple mediums. This is an example video where you can see the kind of combination of the kind of latent walk morphing scene going through the different learned features of the brain, selected still images, and then the kind of discursive text and descriptive text generated by the machine in response to this content. The text was also trained on the written works of the artists that participated in the show as well. You can see over the course of these videos that the background begins to include more and more of the works and the kind of aesthetic features being compiled by the machine and assembled by the machine from the entire breadth of the exhibition's curated list of artists. So it begins from a very limited single artist perspective and begins to add in the features and aesthetics of those others participating in the show. At the same time, that version of the Beast held a social media account on Instagram where it would daily post 3 to 4 of its favorite productions from that day, along with kind of descriptive text for it. One of the things about the original machine was it was each night it would shut down its image production features and it would go kind of lurk on social media. And basically it scrapes the most kind of popular architectural and art images from Instagram and Flickr from that day and begins to fold it back into its training set, kind of relearns how to design each night. For this version, we pivoted it a bit because it's to make the exhibition maybe represent some of the things that we were interested in conceptually a bit better, but also kind of serve better as an online forum. So I'm just going to kind of quickly walk through a day in the life of the Beast in terms of what it produces. The first thing that we wanted to do is move away a little bit from what's kind of become a very well-known trope of the kind of morphing video, the latent walk generation of it, and really start to represent the features as a kind of partial map. So each day, the neural network is going to be producing a kind of thin slice of one region within its brain. We tested a series of different mapping strategies for the grid of this, but we really wanted to start to create an immersive environment on the site where you were looking more at kind of an assembled catalog of possible productions rather than this idea of a kind of continuous blending or morphing of ideas or of aesthetics. We introduced a couple of different ways in which popular engagement with the network and with the exhibition begins to influence the transformation and evolution of it. The first is that each night we're collecting statistics on which is the most selected or most clicked on image from each day. And that image becomes a new center point for the new generated map of the next day's grid. We turn that selected guy into a little bouncy mascot to prove that we still know how the latent walks work, but also because we wanted to give a certain pulse and breadth to the site. The machine then, once it generates that grid, goes through and writes out a series of captions for each one. Training the network to produce captions that we felt were interesting relative to this was one of the more difficult portions, as the types of content that the machine produces are not things that are readily described on social media platforms or kind of popular open source data sets. And then at that point, once it's completed that, it pushes the new content up onto the site for the next day. As soon as it's done that, it goes and lurks on social media. As I mentioned, it starts to scrape for the top-rated architectural imagery and related hashtag imagery from that previous day. Here's an example of the type of work that is in the original Beast content exclusively from the original artist. And then also on the right is kind of example content from this past day's scrape of several leading image-based social media platforms. As the show progresses, more and more social media becomes, or more of these kind of populist selected artworks become a larger percentage of the machine's knowledge base and start to have a greater and greater impact on the aesthetics. So the idea is that this kind of big stack of daily image catalogs that we're producing is going to evolve slowly from an aesthetic that's maybe privileged by the institution or the artists that are participating in the show to one that is kind of more derived from a kind of collective valuation of architectural aesthetics on the internet. This is an example from that evolution from the first version of the Beast, moving from the kind of initial works that it was producing to ones after it's seen quite a few Scottish castles and medieval town centers from social media posts. So I'm going to pass it off now to Anthony, who is going to lead us through the site. Anthony, would you like me to keep the site open on mine, or do you have it open?
You can open it.
Okay.
Yeah, so what Casey was, following what Casey was saying, yeah, we kind of were talking more towards this representation of permutation over morphing or distortion. And that just came out of trying to be more transparent about the machine learning algorithm in general. So as you may know, machine learning goes through multiple neural networks, neural layers. And we wanted to kind of be able to represent that in kind of this two-dimensional space. A lot of gallery websites that we've noticed during this period have tried to kind of replicate a more three-dimensional space or be more one-to-one to what could be a typical gallery space. But we really wanted to lean more into diving into kind of what the algorithm would see. And part of that was being able to interpret these liminal spaces. So these in-between layers that the algorithm explores that has not only kind of illegible interpretations, but patterns that are just not obvious to the human eye. Things that were inspired by were things like Common Denominator by Mario Klingman. They created a website where basically they generated different, basically the machine learning algorithm consumed a bunch of human faces and people were able to interact with this website live. So they were able to change the different parameters of that algorithm and see those effects happen immediately. We kind of swerved away from that because we wanted to, again, make the algorithm more transparent. So like Casey was saying, this process takes a daily route, a daily cycle to generate each permutation. And that is just apparent with algorithms like machine learning. They take a lot of time. They take a lot of computation, which is just kind of a general trend in a lot of contemporary algorithms, such as blockchain or any kind of machine learning algorithm. So yeah, like you can see on this website, basically we have each day have an iteration and you're kind of able to explore each layer of that. We also wanted to add, again, that level of human interactivity. So like Casey was saying, users are able to select different images and that then feeds back into the algorithm. And I think that is what makes this unique, is that there's human intervention within this algorithm. It isn't kind of an ever-consuming, iterative algorithm that just feeds onto its own. There's still kind of this human intervention, this human feedback that is able to curate those images and guide the algorithm in a certain way. So kind of that two-process feedback of not only is the algorithm generating new images, but there is a level of human participation, human intervention that occurs as well.
Thanks. We also have kind of mirroring the original installation, we have a gallery section which has those kind of fully produced pre-generated videos for each artist paired with their image. And so this site will be alive through August 31st, and we welcome everyone to engage with it, interact with it, and start to drive its evolution through your aesthetic choices and engagement. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be moving on now to the objects panel, which will be moderated by Kristy Balliet.
Hello, good evening or good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us for this incredible exhibition that we're all just getting to explore, that was curated by Hernán Díaz Alonso and designed by Rehm, as we've all just heard. I'd like to welcome you specifically to panel 1 on objects. My name is Kristy Balliet, and I am a design faculty member here at SCI-Arc, co-coordinator of graduate thesis and partner of Bear Balliet with Kelly Bear. And for the next 45 minutes, I will be your moderator on a discussion about objects in relationship to AI, or perhaps just on objects. Let's see how it goes. La Bestia, as we're all just learning, finds ways within a pool of images of artifacts via machine learning and connects them through a chain of similarities. I believe all of the panels today, in their own way, will be weaving a discussion that is celebrated by this symposium. Specifically in this panel, fellow object enthusiast to discuss and consider object art of La Bestia. I will do a short round of introductions using a single image from the data set they have each submitted for the exhibition. In alphabetical order, my office begins. For our contribution, we made the decision to submit only model photos from 3 projects that were aesthetically and conceptually linked. I am joined also by Marcelyn Gao, faculty at SCI-Arc, Design Theory and Pedagogy Coordinator, Media Content Manager of the SCI-Arc channel and publications, and partner of Servo Los Angeles, Stockholm. Also joined by Ferda Kolatan, Associate Professor at the University of Pennsylvania and visiting faculty at SCI-Arc, and of course, founding director of SU11 Architecture and Design. We are also joined by Marcelo Spina, design faculty at SCI-Arc and partner in the Office of Patterns. William Virgil is joining us, a design faculty at SCI-Arc and making and meeting coordinator. And finally, Tom Wiscombe is joining us, who is the undergraduate chair at SCI-Arc and head of Tom Wiscombe Architecture. But before we dive in, it is important to note that while the work and interest of the individuals on this panel is varied and diverse, today we have been grouped together because we have all selected to contribute or represent work that could be described as objects. I will stop share now, and hopefully you'll be able to see the faces of all of the panelists that will join me in this discussion. I think as we understand, or as we are all learning, La Bestia is an assembled catalog of possible options that merges learned aesthetic features from all of our submitted work and increasingly from outside sources. So my first question, although I will ask a few this evening, some of them will be more specific to some participants and others will be more general. So my first question is, considering the fact that you were asked to participate in this exhibition, knowing that you were going to be sort of curated and negotiated with an AI, how did you or your office define a data set for submission? And was any object-like qualities a factor for you? I'd like to first open up that question to Marcelyn and Ferda.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Kristy. And I also want to thank very much Hernán for the invitation to participate in this show, and also Casey for the curatorial magic that you and Anthony and the AI put together for us. Really amazing. So, you know, one thing that comes to my mind that was really striking about working in producing the data set for the show was the sort of almost absurdity of being asked to generate 400 plus images that were 256 by 256 pixels. When I got that instruction, I was like, wait, this is madness. Because normally when we participate in exhibitions, you know, you look for the really high res, the image that's going to showcase your work and contain all the information you want to be communicated about it. And so, I'm curious to see if our other panelists felt the same way. It was sort of shocking to see aspects of one's work, reduced down to that low resolution threshold. And for me, that was really provocative because it brought up the question of at what point does the image slip away, like the loss of resolution? At what point do I still feel like this actually corresponds to the project, or does it take on another life of its own? And so that was one striking aspect that made me think about, like, where does one object end, another begin? Mm-hmm. The other was this kind of elasticity of authorship that starts to emerge once we're all kind of in the pool together. And this idea of collaboration, that not only are machines collaborating with humans, and as Anthony pointed out, there's a degree of human intervention, that it's not just purely algorithmic processes. Mm-hmm. And so also all of our intentionalities getting mixed into that admixture. And then, the collaboration between each of the participants. And so to me, it also raises the question of that elastic authorship. Like, to what extent then this new work that's generated by the beast kind of belongs to all of us, but simultaneously to none. So those are just a couple thoughts I had to start off with. Maybe Ferda has...
Yeah, I'm sure Ferda will have a lot to say as well. I'm super curious how he selected. But maybe just really quick, Marcelyn, like, was thinking about, were you then specifically, when you had to go to that lower res, were you then specifically looking for images of things that could be described as objects, or was that somewhat coincidental?
Yes. Yeah, okay. In fact, there was like one show, Semblances. One of the images that we chose was, the whole show was really about that space between an object and image. And so images in that exhibition were up-resed, sort of adding not information, but just pixels. And to the point where then you could extract pixels, extrude them, generate masses, 3D print those. And so there was an inversion of the convention that an image might document an object. In that exhibition, the image produced the object. So we were sort of thinking conceptually about some of those issues when we chose the things that we chose. We were also looking for edges and silhouettes that might give, sort of a high degree of legibility, because we were anticipating that this would dissolve.
Great. Well, Ferda, you can jump in however you'd like, although edges and silhouettes seems like a good place.
Yeah. First of all, I also want to thank all of you, and of course, Hernán and Casey in particular, for the invitation, for the original Frack show, and now also for this. It's also really fun to see all of you again, and thanks, Kristy, for moderating. Well, I do remember being perplexed, having to choose sort of an archive, a repertoire of images, because it took me a certain amount of time to understand really what was going to happen. That kind of grew in conversations prior to the Frack show also. And I remember, similar to what Marcelyn was saying, it was pretty clear that the point wasn't to pick images like we would usually pick it to represent our work, but to somehow try to foresee or forethink or forebode what the AI will understand in terms of feature sets. Mm-hmm. So I was asking myself, so what are the types of characteristics that I think are the most interesting to me in our work? And try to sort of like project them forward. And that was an important part in what kind of projects to select. I have to say, though, I failed miserably in foreseeing any of it, or even thinking it would make a difference. Because clearly, it's a super interesting project, but it's not something that you can really control beyond a certain point. And that's, of course, the point and the beauty of it. I mean, once the engine takes over in a very short period of time, and I saw that when I was, actually at the exhibition itself in Orléans, things started to get completely out of hand. It was more interesting to me to also see how the text was running in parallel to the object itself. There was a longer, let's say, time frame within which the text was still somewhat recognizable or characteristic.
Yeah.
And was producing variations on the theme that, to me, with a human brain, were kind of, I could maintain the relationship more closely with the text than I could with the images, which very quickly started to take on all the other qualities from all the other projects. So that was really interesting for me to see. And I think it's really a brilliant part of the way how this was set up, that there was simultaneously the image and the text. And I think since this is the object panel, to me, of course, both the image as well as the text are objects, in a triple sense of the word object. And I think it really makes sense in the context of the production for the exhibition.
Yeah, thank you. That actually brings me up to sort of a second territory of questioning that I'd like to open up and maybe segue with. I think I sent, when I was exploring the website earlier today, I came across one of those convergences of the text and the imagery that was being compiled. And I sent it to my partner, Kelly, and I said, I hope that that the text reads a cluster of elephants in a blue background. And I texted to her that I somehow hoped that our work was contributing to this cluster of elephants. We certainly have some work, I think, that we contributed that had some of those maybe elephant-like characteristics if I were to look at it through that lens. Which maybe brings up my second territory of questioning, which is maybe for William and Marcelo, although others can jump in. And then Tom, I have one specifically for you. And that is for William and Marcelo, the role of, when you think of maybe objects in terms of your office and the work that you produce. I think both of you in the items that you submitted, or at least the ones that I had access to, the role of character and the role of materiality, I think, in their relationship to objects, I think seem really prominent in both of your work in different ways. And so I wondered if you could speak about that.
Yeah, absolutely, Kristy. Thank you, Hernán, for curating this, and thank you, Casey, for designing it. The work is amazing, and it's wonderful to see all this unexpected twist on all our works. I would say, Kristy, for us in our practice, it was more about what kind of project we submit and what was the audience that we wanted to engage. Of course, unknowingly, we didn't know that, and we didn't expect that the projects that we submitted were going to be fused to the extent in which the original, the character, it was going to be unrecognizable. So that for us, it was a very good surprise. We think a lot about who are we engaging, and the way that we see it is what's the audience that we want to that we want to engage in conversation with. So we pretty much started with objects that are recognizable from any age, any I would say any background. Those are characters that you're able to recognize. And of course, when we submitted the work, we, just like all of us, we did not expect any outcome, but we wanted to see if by challenging the machine with objects that are very recognizable and how these objects will fuse with others, we were still able to maintain the qualities of the recognizable between the characters that we chose to submit. I guess we still have till August 21st to see if that comes true. But for us, that was kind of like the main goal when we decided to submit the projects that we did. We were very interested in unpredictability of the objects that we choose to work with. And definitely this mode of representing and pushing the work is showing us another, I would say, another logic to the projects that we submitted, in which the object and the image, they become one, and they're fused by the intelligence of the machine and how the machine decides to link the projects within our own work. And once it starts looking and extracting content from works of similar characteristics or things that it's just pulling information from somewhere else.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I love the idea that in your, like, looking at your data set, the characters are so recognizable, as you said, the idea that people would be able to recognize them. And I thought it would be interesting to have that conversation across you and Marcelo, because I think Marcelo, again, and I don't know everyone's full data set, but certainly the object that was sort of represented there is, it's almost like an object that's hiding in plain sight in some ways. Like it's unlike Williams, where characteristics are meant to be really like jump off the page in a way. In your work, William, I think, Marcelo, your attitude about sort of objects in their context and legibility, I think is quite different. So it'd be curious to hear from you on that topic.
Yeah, thank you, Kristy. And again, thanks, Hernán and Casey, for such a wonderful job. First, like a quick thing that when I was invited, not to the show in FRAC or this, but when I got the email for this one, for this particular show, where we may have noticed that the switch from kind of English to Spanish, I literally thought that maybe this is a kind of daydreaming we all have about this. It's like really crazy pandemic. I really thought we were going for dinner to Bestia, which is one of my very close to school. And that lasted probably a couple of instants, for those of you, outside LA, just a place worth visit. Just to put a little humor on this on a Saturday evening, we're all still at home. But I had same thoughts as Marcelyn and same thoughts of Ferda. I knew that whatever we did to try and somehow keep the kind of distortion frequency that Casey will set into motion would be kind of futile. It would only be maybe a short delay of what was inevitable. We thought, what is the role of objects? We thought and our book is really about these things. In a certain way, we tend to think of as sort of images in a very sort of compartmentalized ways. This sort of what we submitted as a data set was actually really all what we call sort of hyperaxons. Isometrics, axonometrics, objects that we made a point of being floated on a white background. Most of them, until we kind of ran out, because it will basically reduce the distortion of combining with objects that have background. As I've seen. In working with Casey in the context of teaching together, what the distortions would have been. AI would not recognize, AI would pay more attention to a kind of a central point perspective rather than if the building is a classical building or it's a modern building. The perspective will match, and then, for certain AI engines, and I'm sure Casey could probably dispute this, it will just put them together. And so I thought, okay, they're just really going to send objects of a certain kind in our mind, even though we work with drawings, that we work with and our image actually for the show, the freestanding image is actually a sort of a photoreal one-point perspective rendering. These were all more like objects, as you mentioned, floating on a white background, isometrics, which already have, I will argue, pretty distorted by some sort of disciplinary medium. And so in a certain way, their qualities are kind of somewhat removed or somewhat already withdrawn from, let's say, the so-called real of that object. So, those were our thoughts. I guess my thinking after seeing that were that I don't know, what would have happened if we could have just sent the most kind of crazy number of stuff that really didn't belong together. What would have done? I'm not so sure. I'm still happy we did that. It was an interesting exercise to see how you can, maybe in a kind of conservative way, how you can keep it from being breed, as you said, hybridize, and
Right. Great. Thank you. And as promised, Tom, I think maybe a segue. Marcelo, I didn't quite know that about your data set in terms of the kind of really being specific about the type of representation that they kind of highlighted, the axonometric, the isometric, and thinking about how the AI would see that. So I think that I didn't know if I would have segues in my questions, but I think that segues nicely to Tom, what I wanted to talk to you about or ask you here. And again, I haven't seen everyone's data set, but I do know that the role of physical models as a medium of representation is incredibly important in your office. And the image that we used, that I know that you submitted at least some, in part, some physical model images. And so I would be curious in terms of the panel here on objects, like how do you see the role of the physical model in your office as a sort of a representation of something else, or an object itself that has its own set of kind of qualities? And certainly you can also talk about what you were thinking about in terms of how you packaged a data set for the beast.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, to be completely honest with you, I wasn't totally clear what we were submitting because there was a bunch of stuff, and I don't totally know. I remember I was thinking the idea of even calling it a data set, I remember kind of bugged me because, I think like I look at one of these images, let's say there's 400, and one of these images, it took me like 6 months to do. So I can't think of it as a flow of work like that, like as an oeuvre, really. To me, it's like one by one, each project. So it's kind of a horrifying idea to throw it into this flow. I guess I feel the same horror when I throw my work into the flow of Instagram too. It's like, it's just getting chewed up and sort of processed and forgotten very quickly. And so yeah, that was like my first thought. But then I really think this whole show though, and I think the brilliance of what Casey's doing is, it's like, at the end of the day, I think it's about human free will. And are there other free wills out there? And what do we even think free will is? And, do we define free will? Or let's say at least an artistic or aesthetic free will as like a thing that can, like collect things that it likes, select things, and well, I guess first of all, it sees things and then it decides to like things, and then it selects things that move on to the next level. And in some sense, by saying that, it sounds like I'm talking about an artist or an architect already, because that's kind of what we do. It's just that, we're giving it a lot of credit by calling it an artificial intelligence. I think right now it's like artificial and slightly intelligent. But it definitely made me think about, the degree to which, in some sense, the work that we already do is already very much like that. We see things we like, both in the world and from our colleagues and from history, and we like them, and then we select them, and then they sort of get pulled into our oeuvre and our way of working and our own sensibility. And it's so odd and intriguing and amazing to imagine there's another being out there, this digital being that can do similar things. The difference is that it doesn't see the historical and the cultural cues in the images. It only sees the pixels and the colors and like you were saying, Marcelyn, it sees the silhouettes, and the shapes of things, but it doesn't know what's behind it. Whereas the human intelligence goes in and sees all those things right away, as well as just the aesthetic moment. So I don't know. I think the whole thing is super intriguing. I tend to be suspicious about some of the outcomes of the piece, because it does. I think you said it, William. Like, it kind of made everything indistinguishable and sort of stirred the pot too much. Where I would have hoped it would have had a little bit more of an aesthetic sensibility, where it would only pick like two things that it liked, or even one case would be like he picks one, or she or whoever it is, they pick one thing that it likes, and it doesn't even try to fuse it with anything else, because it's like, I don't like the rest of that stuff. I picked this one type of, or like you were saying, Ferda, this one set of formal features, So I guess the fact that it stirred everything up and turned everything into like a big Korean seafood pancake or whatever, I think it was a little bit alarming to me when I first saw the outcome. But yeah, but at the end of the day, I just think it's about, it's about the creative process and, authorship and, and the degree to which our ideas about authorship are maybe very, very similar to what the AI is actually doing step by step. So yeah, and then to answer your question about models, I mean, yeah, I mean, the models for me right now are really crucial for our practice. And part of the models, though, part of the thing about the models now is I'm starting to photograph them even in their normal backgrounds, like around the office or with plants behind it or the actual sky or people. And so they already have almost like a dual ontology, like they have the scale at which they're at and the scale that they're modeling. And then they're in this other human real scale, which is not the scale of the built object, but it's the scale of my office and the people there. And so there's already a kind of double ontology thing going on there for me, the way I see it. And so to throw that against a bunch of other projects that have a manufactured background and a manufactured foreground, I'm sure the AI was like, oh, what do I do with that? So that's maybe one different things to some of the other work that other architects have contributed. Yeah, no, for sure. I'm glad you brought that up because I love that. I mean, I too, or Kelly and I submitted, I think like all of you, we kind of figured out like, is it going to be 400 images from one project? Is it going to be 8 different types of representation of one idea? And we settled on, I mean, we also make quite a few models in the object or in our office. It's kind of our preferred output. And so we went and said, well, we found 3 models that were aesthetically related to one another, and then photographed them in the round to produce like the 400 images. And that maybe gets me to maybe furthering what you're talking about, Tom, or opening up to the rest of you, this idea of like how important it is that objects are often understood in the round, and maybe don't have like a hierarchy of orientation, and how we think about that. One, in relationship to what you just around, like the big plant that you have, all of a sudden that object starts to have, a background, a foreground, and a middle ground, versus Marcelo, maybe your attitude, and I think Ferda, at least the images that I saw, the object is very much there and the background is completely blank, right? There is no context, so that it seems to prioritize the fact that this is an object that we could understand in the round. And so I guess maybe as our final, I think we have like 10 more minutes. The final question would be, when submitting 400 images to a machine that's only going to look at images, that is then going to produce images, what do we think that means for how important each of us or architects in general might think about producing objects?
Maybe if I can jump in on something that is like, lurking on this, or when we submitted, we submitted that data set and I explained, but the image we submitted to actually be like freestanding was a kind of a 1-point perspective, and it had a caption of it. I mean, it had a story on it, and its story for me, it's really a question of meaning. Like whatever this might be. I mean, perspectives tell a certain story which maybe models or axons or drawings don't tell. And that's what actually makes them interesting, I mean, for me, at least, there's some kind of real within our field. I mean, like the real outside is one thing, but then the real, in terms of like models are real, drawings are real, any of these things are real. And it seems to me that what, and that was sort of perplexing, it's like at which point that meaning kind of ceased to exist, I mean, there was certain meaning that one could actually make up on some of the text. And then the images at some point became sort of so distorted that I guess somebody could project meaning. I certainly could not. And so, I mean, what is the relationship between because for me, otherwise they're just graphics, which are not images for me. Images in this case are objects, in one kind. They have that possibility of elicit that sort of, aspect of like, what do we think about it? Can we project something? Whereas like, when they become too abstracted because they're just crossover with many things, or they kind of blend into too many other things, it's complicated, So I don't know. For me, this is a kind of an interesting problematic that this kind of work that. Sorry, my dog is like wanting to go up. But one problematic, which I think is fascinating, but it's certainly problematic, in my view. I mean, to be a bit critical about what this does with the work. How selective is it? Can we still check some form of meaning, or it's just like a kind of question of like how many more bits, how many more like pixels have been blended into something that is like not distillable anymore, and therefore it's no longer my work or anyone else's work, but like it's just like something crowds.
Yeah, maybe just to jump in and pick up on what Marcelo was saying, and also Tom in many ways. I mean, I totally agree with both Marcelo and Tom's sentiments in terms of looking at the project becoming so distorted or uniformalized or homogenized after a certain period of time, that I was kind of losing, as I said in the beginning, my ability to sort of see or find the type of meaning I was looking for. But that's also presumably the point, right? I mean, the point would be to see, and I don't think we're there yet, but clearly we're going in that direction, to see if something utterly different, a different kind of intelligence, a different kind of aesthetic is going to emerge. And we may just not like it. And that may just be what it is. It seems to me, ontologically speaking, that's the more interesting project. Because I think we're pretty good in making things look computational and control it, right? We can all do that in many different ways. But I think the moment the AI begins to sort of truly do its own tricks, I think that's going to be interesting for me. Again, maybe not pleasing, and certainly disturbing if it does it with our work, because like it was pointed out, I mean, it just, we still have that somewhat anthropocentric notion of ownership in regard to what we produce and put into the world. It was interesting when Tom was saying that to him it's about free will. Does the computer or the AI have free will? And I was almost thinking the other way around through this. I was thinking, well, are we just deterministic in the same way, just slightly to a higher degree? And this is an old philosophical question, between determinism and free will, and we bounce back from one side to the other. And it seems that AI right now is sort of playing really into the acceleration of this particular question. So I'm very interested. I have certainly two sides to this, something that is more sort of almost conservative, wanting to hold on to certain aspects that I think I can control. And it's the type of meaning I want to see in the world. And then this other thing, I want to say one quick other thing, and then let other people get to chime in, of course. But I think there's a notion that we play along with AI, or it's some kind of partnership. I hear that a lot, with people who work a lot with AI, like to think of computation as a partner. I don't think it's going to be a partner. I just want to put that out there. It's going to be its own thing, and it may even be an adversary. And again, I say that sort of partially with excitement, because sometimes you need an adversary in order to really, sort of have change happen on some kind of fundamental level. But this notion that somehow we can play ping pong, it's, I think in a very short amount of time, we'll realize that's just not going to be the case. I would even argue that the whole phenomenon of social media, let's say, has already proven that. I mean, it's really, it's its own kind of entity, and it will be multiple agencies and authorships and so forth that will most likely compete. That's how I'm looking at this.
I think that's super, super interesting, Ferda. I agree with you. What I was saying about free will is I'm more suspicious that we here on this panel don't have very much of it. Looking at the AI, I've always believed that. But so true what you're saying about it made it being almost unrecognizable to us. And I think eventually its selections being almost unrecognizable and maybe even scary. I totally agree with that. And it's really interesting how, right now we're basically, or Casey is feeding it the outcomes of human culture, right? That's what it's being fed right now. But I keep thinking, what happens when you feed it other things approaching more like ideas, and not just pixels of color on or off, and how that kind of interface would start to look. Because I think without ideas, it will only ever be an image processor or like an art breeder, or all the things that we've seen that started to come out many years ago on apps and all that stuff. So I'm super curious when it starts to look at history and maybe even the history of architecture, I don't know, in a completely different way. And at some point when it starts to be dissatisfied with the human, the human objects that it's being fed, and desires other things. I don't know. So I totally agree, though. I think that's where it gets really interesting. Right now, it's like it's being fed this sort of baby food until it grows up.
Thank you.
A strange shift in terms of like what happens to identity. Because when I started to look at all the things that are being generated, and I logged in there today, and I look for flickers of familiarity, like, that came from one of our images, but then the more I stare at it, I'm like, no, this could be, and I start to match it to other things, and then I realize it's so elusive. Like to me, that is fascinating, problematic, but fascinating. That it's sort of like it's partially there's some intentionality as an author that I put in there. But now I'm being confronted with this thing that I no longer really understand what the criteria were. And so I think that sort of difference between human cognition and what our intentions and criteria are when we're generating things and designing things and putting things into the world, and then how that might differ from the kind of criteria with which the machine is putting things into the world. And I don't know, at some point, I don't know if we can even use the word aesthetics. When we talk about maybe there's a new aesthetic that emerges, I think then maybe it's no longer called aesthetics. But it's fascinating to think about.
Great. I think we have just a moment left. I'd like to, William, give you an opportunity maybe to make a closing comment, and it could be on whatever you'd like. But I do think this topic that Marcelyn and Tom are bringing up in different ways of the fact that we're feeding it sort of cultural content, and the fact that I think you've indicated that, at least in the work that you often are doing and that you've selected for this exhibition, you as an author select cultural content and work with it as a medium within your practice. So I'd be curious, maybe any final thoughts from you on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kristy. So not to echo what others have said, but definitely, I guess all of us looking at objects, we enforce some sort of control in the things that we create. And especially to be able to see how a machine takes our hard work and dismantle it in a way that it's hard to recognize is definitely gives us some sort of sense of I would say like maybe frustration, because it's acting and there's nothing we could do about it. But I would say for me, I don't know if it might be matters of I would say embracing the own control that the machine is imposing in the work. And maybe it's the way in which Casey, as a curator, as a designer, is able to maybe calibrate the machine in a way in which it only merges with other objects, or is only merging with objects with no background. And whenever it looks at social content, maybe it's only merging with other objects that are from common themes, figures, products, et cetera, shoes. And maybe if he's able to somehow manipulate the machine and kind of like categorize the way in which it starts reading and giving characteristics to the things it creates, then maybe some of us could be more pleased with the outcome.
Great. Well, thank you, all of you. Our time about objects has gone by really fast. So I want to thank you all for jumping on this evening to join us in this conversation, or this morning, depending on where you're watching from. And I'd like to just let all of you panelists know that I'm glad that my objects get to play with your objects for the next couple of months. And I look forward to seeing all of you in person very soon. And up next, as the objects panel says goodbye, we welcome the graphics panel that will be moderated by Elena Manferdini. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristy.
Bye.
So the second panel is called Graphic. And the panelists are going to be Ramiro Diazgranados, Florencia Pita, Devyn, Peter Testa, and Devyn Weiser. And I'm going to now introduce them to you. Ramiro Diazgranados is a faculty at SCI-Arc. He teaches applied studies, design studios, and visual studies. Ramiro received his B.Arc from SCI-Arc, so he's an alumni of the school, and his M.Arc from UCLA in 2003. He is the founder and principal of Amorphous, a design and architectural office in Los Angeles. Second panelist is Florencia Pita. She's also faculty at SCI-Arc. She teaches design studios, visual studies. She also has been coordinating thesis for the past 5 years. Florencia graduated from the National University of Rosario in Argentina, and in 2001, she received her master's degree in architecture from Columbia University. She is the founder and principal of Florencia Pita & Co., a design and architectural office in Los Angeles. Devyn, postgraduate chair, and also MS Synthetic Landscape Coordinator. David received his M.Arc degree from Columbia University and his BA degree from St. John's College, where he studied philosophy and mathematics. He is founding partner at Klein. Peter Testa, he teaches design studio and applied studies. He holds a B.Arc and a SM.Arc.S in history theory from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is a founding partner at Testa Weiser. Devyn Weiser, she is the visual study coordinator and gateway portfolio coordinator. Not only, she also teaches design studio and visual studies. Devyn holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts and Bachelor of Architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design and a Master of Architecture from Columbia University. She's also founding partner at Testa Weiser. And finally, I will introduce myself. My name is Elena Manferdini. I'm the graduate program chair at SCI-Arc, where I teach design studios and visual studies. I have a degree from the University of Civil Engineering in Bologna, and also an M.Arc from UCLA in Los Angeles. I'm the founder and principal of Atelier Manferdini, an office in Los Angeles. And now, I'm going to tell you some of the thoughts behind these panels and what you will, and the kind of ideas that we'll try to explore. First of all, Bestia, I love the name, finds pathways within a pool of images of artifacts via machine learning, connecting them through a chain of similarities and breeding a scenic route through the work of SCI-Arc faculties between reality and fiction. Bestia consider graphics, so the six of us, as they are linked by low degree of separation. So somehow the algorithm thought all of us have something in common. And it is precisely this low degree of separation that allows a machine to learn and produce new species. So proximity truly becomes generative because it is seated in order that can be recognized, produced, and manipulated. So nowadays, I think contemporary architectural practices have embraced a way of working that utilizes scripting, chronicles, robotic fabrication, AI, and digitalized replicas. So doubling is a new normal that subverts the one-off and glorifies multiples. One could argue that as designers, we operate in a society of duplicates and copies, where originality is merely a romantic deception. Mass production is our way of living. Architecture should theorize similarities rather than originality and explore the relationship of replicas in the composition of the current design culture. And so let me now introduce you to Florencia, and I'll just give a sentence that I thought would be a good one for her to start to speak to us about her work for La Bestia, that I thought was interesting because she decided to use as her set of images silkscreen printing. And I thought that that was a great point of departure, because if you look back at the practice of printing, silkscreening, etching, stamping, copies really have been always part of the process of dissemination of idea and creativity. So the original is simply a tool to create the copies. So the piece that you use to make those things is just a tool. It does not anything about the first one. The printed copy was intended output. So I will now start showing the images of Florencia while she can tell about a little bit more about her approach to the Bestia and what she selected for the project.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Hernán, for curating, and Casey for putting together the machine for us. So as Elena just said, the idea, and I think as the previous panel had said, the idea of like, what image do you choose to feed the monster or the Bestia? You know, what is this Bestia eating? And the idea that the machine will somehow absorb that material and somehow recreate, to its own wish. I thought that the work that we were doing at the office at that moment, and this is an example of that, the kind of the raw image of the stuff on a table in the office, and not from a computer, but actually a kind of a physical output of a Bestia that we have, which is the silk screen. The idea that you can feed that machine, that really simple analog, and I would say antique machine, which is that frame, you can feed paint, and then you can get graphics out of that. Painters have used silk screening in other ways. How can an architect really use it? How you can start feeding images, how you can start to kind of transfer images on the film. It's very much kind of a parallel to the way that you look at, how you feed an algorithm. I thought that it was interesting also in the earlier symposium. I mean, Ferda was saying, there's a battle of ping pong to the image. I think this is more like the chess set that Grandmaster Kasparov lost to the blue. I mean, we lose to this machine. So how, and I also thought it was interesting to see in the previous panel how you start to look at the notion of selection. I thought that the parallel to silk screening and graphics related to that notion of selection. Not every copy that you get out of this machine, it's ideal. Not every copy has come as you like. This is an image where we try to mimic line drawings, and the line drawings converted into paint, and you start to get a blur. I mean, similar to the blur that you get from the algorithm, similar to that kind of fuzziness that you get from, let's say, the machine Bestia. So this is another example. What do you transfer? On what are you reading from these images? The notion is that you don't read much, and you don't have to understand. They're not drawings, and in this case, graphics becomes abstraction, yet it maintains some of the kind of qualities, the contours. So I think that Marcelyn was also talking earlier about the website. When you start to find similarities, what is the aesthetic values that this machine outputs? in a still screen, what you get is that you make a selection. I saw that Wiscombe was also great at saying that you still need to quantify, qualify. Somehow the machine does not qualify for you. It doesn't quantify for you. It doesn't abstract. It doesn't catalog. How do we catalog? The still screening also as a machine outputs a lot of material, but then you start to catalog it. You start to find discrepancies. You start to find qualities. You start to find graphics and textures and what are the colors, some color combinations, work, some don't. So I thought that in the conversation, through graphics, through AI, this made a parallel, the kind of the graphic image made a parallel. None of these images are digital, they're all analogs, but they're all feed into a digital input. They're all kind of recreated. And in a longer lecture, this is only 5 minutes to talk, we will go into that phase of how you make this into architecture, which is that the same as that kind of the battle with image. Thankfully, you start to look at, and when you see, I think in the next slide, Elena, it's the actual Bestia, which is the digital Bestia, which is the video that Casey put together, which is this, also issue of resolution, low resolution, it's painful for any designer. So we suffer through that. So when you look at the output that it was done, once it was fit to the Bestia, to the beast, then you start to see that still screening is happy to be there. It will always stay in abstraction. It would maintain the similar qualities. It would acquire, it's like it's this my timer. It will fit. Sorry, Elena, I wanted to be on time. 5 minutes. So seeing again. So this would be the kind of AI version of the previous pure paint images that preceded this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Florencia, for the beautiful images and the beautiful work. Let me see, is this advanced or not? Let me see, we managed, okay. I thought, to me, one thing that was very interesting about the whole ordeal of the Bestia is that La Bestia comes from almost a Darwinian view of the world, meaning that there is somehow an ordering system that the computer is seeing in the same way that I think humans are trained towards the ordering system and patterns. Although the Darwinian system takes a long time to get there, meaning that we have a long evolution to become Darwinian, to become what we are now. The Bestia goes fast because the computer goes fast and it understands pattern in the way in which we train it to. And I wanted to give some examples of what I'm trying to say. So Thomas Mann, order and simplification are the first steps towards mastery of a subject. I think this is true for both the computer and both human mind. And in a way, the whole struggle of AI, making a computer see something that is not visual for the computer. The computer truly is just bits and pieces. The computer doesn't see color association, doesn't see features, doesn't see what we see as human being, but somehow there are certain layers that you put in between the machine and the image so that therefore you train the machine to see those. And so to me, it's interesting because the computer sees something very different from what we see as human. And we're trying to train the machine to do something that humans do quite quickly, actually. And is in the discrepancy between what the machine does and what we do that we find creativity. So somehow it's not like the machine is creative. I think machines are not creative and human beings are not creative either. I think we just process pattern of informations and we've been trained to do pattern, to look at pattern of information for many, many centuries, actually, millions of years probably. And so what we see the machine doing is just doing that quite fast. And so the computation brought us to this kind of level of efficiency in producing multiplicity, seeing different patterns than what we're used to see as humans. So to me, the Darwinian sense of the machine is the most interesting one. And then to me, it seems like there are some other aspects of the issue of the copy that are interesting. So that one thing alone doesn't make any meaning, doesn't really produce the behavior, doesn't really produce something that the machine can see, as well as the work probably of creative beings is the one that actually goes through families of objects, families of prints, families of graphics, family of projects. So somehow the machine itself also goes through iterations, but I do think that that's something that humankind does as well. And creativity is truly not something that comes from something original, but comes from the discrepancy between A and B, and the discrepancy between the two is what creates something new. So in general, I think there is not much novelty. The novelty is a discrepancy that moves along the problem that one can see. Some more examples. So this is the video that I think was merging some of our data sets with all the other 6 data sets. So you can see how then the work starts speciating with other work. And in a way, I wanted to also show that even the work we do in the office is somehow very similar to this one, even though it's all scripted, it's all copied, it's all variations of one image into multiple images, that somehow there is an hybridization of work even within the work. So somehow that what the computer is doing is somehow what we are doing is just simply different eyes. And it's in the discrepancy that I think becomes interesting, to the point that I would assume that the computers are creative, not because they're creative, but because they operate with ordering system in the way in which human beings do. So I wanted to use this sentence of Gombrich, perception as a working hypothesis to establish a fit between our senses and the reality for the outside world. And maybe I have a question now for some of our panelists. Thank you, Florencia, for your introduction of the work. I would like to ask Ramiro Diazgranados and Peter Testa. Maybe one of the other questions that I thought was the most interesting one about this whole endeavor of La Bestia is that computation really has widened the archives of architecture and disrupted the association of the ideas related to canonical ordering systems. And I think that's actually quite a groundbreaking effect of computation. And so I wanted to open the questions to maybe Ramiro to begin with.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. It's great being here. And thanks to Hernán and Casey for including me and setting all this up. In thinking about this, I kind of thought of this question as in 2 parts. And the first one, I think, has to do with more the role of the internet than, let's say, software. But the idea that the internet basically is a repository of raw material. And so it produces this disciplinary shift from shared ideology, let's say, to shared stuff and shared access. And that is primarily in the form of images. And so it made me start to think of images as a kind of form of currency that buys and sells our attention, both through social media, websites, all the various kind of platforms that we use. And with that, I think it raises, or it makes Walter Benjamin's kind of ideas and theories probably more relevant today than ever. And his notes and ideas on distraction and concentration in relationship to the work of art, whether we're being absorbed by it or it's absorbing us. And so, it's funny, I was thinking that less than a month ago, a crypto art sold for $69 million, a JPEG sold for that much in the form of an NFT. And the idea now that through the blockchain that you can authenticate a digital file and actually begin to exchange that, and that you can write the rules for the artist that created that image so that they receive a percentage of every time that artwork sells is pretty astounding. And so in the images that I've included here, they're not so much my own work, but more sketches of this idea of grabbing others' work, altering that image, and then curating collections of that. So in this case, taking one of Neil Denari's projects as corrugated duct house and altering its context or decontextualizing it, which can only be done through a kind of close reading of it or an understanding of it in a certain way. And then feeding it back into Pinterest, those two images, to create two different sets of collections. And then taking all of those images and feeding it through a script, which is kind of similar to what's being done with all of the images from our work, into this kind of mesmerizing, kind of optical, mesmerizing kind of animation or video that relies on pixelation. So that's what this is. But so just one last thing I wanted to say on that is another thing that I think about, and all this work was a precursor for a current visual studies seminar that I'm teaching. But this idea of three modes of attention or three modes of reading, from close reading, which is more traditional, to hyper reading and machine reading, and trying to bridge the gap between close reading and machine reading, which we're kind of is what we're seeing today with Bestia. I'll stop there. So.
So maybe also a few words about the problem of order. Now, when you think about order, everyone knows what order looks like for most purposes, like implies Roman, Latin, or the Greek, the column, the beam that it carries, and called an order. There is a large repository of these recognizable types, both ordinary, that is a classical, and exotic. So what what happens when the computation expands so much the archive that the order is so much more than what we used to do or what we used to understand. I think there are great implications in doing this, and maybe we would like to invite Peter Testa to give his view on the topic.
Great, thank you very much, everyone, and Elena. I feel a lot of kinship with a lot of the things that have been expressed so far this evening. And with Ramiro, I think to continue the discussion here, that I think that new ways of seeing have, of course, always been the first means by which architecture becomes speculative. So I would say computation clearly is allowing us to model, redraw, revision, and possibly re-see and reanimate the archives of architecture in a number of different ways. So I think we now have many interfaces, from technical to more casual and social media like Instagram, and that these platforms have undoubtedly disrupted the hierarchical ordering of architectural archives. So, but this flattening of platform and interface has a lot to do with computation, but these interfaces also have built-in biases. So effectively, another, and maybe in some cases like the AI, less accessible ordering systems these biases are being programmed into them as well. So in our original submission to Bestia, we played with the visual regime of machine vision and machine learning and code as an exercise to keep our subjectivity more acute. And I think that's an attitude that I think I share with many others here, and especially comments by Tom and Ferda about a double ontology. So for Bestia, we worked in what we called at the time beast mode, as a kind of double description or double disruption. So the first description or disruption is the computational term you're referring to, Elena, that uses, in our case, an apparatus that disrupts the historical canon, in this case, a collection of Ledoux's archives from Ledoux's archives, not combining anything, but actually using each instance as a whole and playing with that set of elements in a new syntax, or looking for latent ordering systems that were within those, let's say, objects. So that's kind of the first turn. And the second turn focuses on disrupting computation and legibility using techniques to constrain visual interfaces and using what we call fidgetality to disrupt the computer and AI. And this, I think, comes to this point about the friction and maybe the adversarial. Hernán mentioned the idea of friction at the beginning, and I think that's really interesting, that we in the digital space, we lack a certain kind of friction that we're all need to keep us fresh, if you will, and keep us moving forward. So in a way, this is a kind of friction that we can take advantage of. And I think also this idea of challenging our own biases here. So in our case, I think what we tried to do was to use techniques anticipating, as others have mentioned, the AI, using techniques to constrain visual interfaces and disrupt the AI reading of the material that we were submitting. So foreground and background in our images are collapsed. The kinds of texture maps we use don't fit perfectly to pixels. Our colors are close to one another. And for our amusement, we added analog steps by printing out digital files. So along with Florencia, the idea of a kind of, let's say, physical printing and working on the images with glitter and holographic tapes that are difficult for machine vision to interpret, and then rescanning those images. So our images were intentionally kind of layered and phygital, not so much to try to control the AI, but to kind of feed back on ourselves, to challenge, use it as a way of continuing to elaborate our work further. So this, I think, has been a really interesting experience, and I'm really enjoying the overall discussion this evening as we're trying to grapple with all of this new and exciting possibilities for architecture.
I completely agree with you, Peter, that this is a moment of change, I think. And also there are questions that I think open up issues about ethics or how we use this work, and really what is behind this work and what then it does to our field of architecture, which I think is in a way liberating and challenging, and it changes the limits to what we understand as being architecture. And the familiarity. That's why I wanted to use this sentence. The force of habit makes itself felt in the greater ease with which we take in the familiar. So we're a creature of habits. So what happens with something like this enter the realm of thinking for architects? And so now we'd like to invite David Rood and Devyn Weiser to talk about maybe the last portion of our panel. Is AI automating our subjectivity? What are the dangers? How will be liberating in unexpected ways?
Well, so Devyn and I think we're just going to try to chat while the images are running. I think you and I agree that we're not giving up any of our autonomy, and simply because we're going to refuse to, and maybe that's a little bit overblown. You know, I was just thinking it might be like if we compare it to like Amazon, like you probably have a kind of AI system that is presenting us with all these books we might want to buy, but then it's always going to be up to us to pick the one we're going to buy. I guess to fully give up that autonomy and automate our subjectivity entirely would be like Amazon just sending us books, without us even deciding. So I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
No, I'm not so sure, David. I think that our subjectivity, or what we think is our subjectivity, is now getting incorporated and fed back into just about everything we do, so that maybe the actual book is not going to be mailed to us, but the recommendation for the book seems to be, at least on my computer screen, seems to be very suggestive of, what show do you want to watch, what image do you want to see, what book do you want to read, and what friends do you want to have. And so there's definitely, and this has been well documented now, and there's some, great papers, research papers, and interviews with well-known computer scientists about the way that these images have been manipulated through AI and fed back to us in such a way that we may not even be aware of what's just happened, and that the biases that are implicit in a lot of these algorithms at a whole range of scales about what they can see, how they can read it, who they're representing or underrepresenting. There's a lot of that obviously we're becoming more conscious of this, but it's already, I think, implicit in a lot of the tool sets that we use. And so what you and I were talking about the other day, I thought was really interesting, which is kind of like hands-on, hands-off, like where and how do we kind of engage some of these tools. And it's not just AI, I would expand that to say, any software that we use also needs some kind of consciousness or awareness of where the authorship is or creativity is.
I think your caution is very well founded, and I do agree with you that it's not quite as simple as, well, I always get to decide what I want to buy on Amazon, because nonetheless, the options are being scripted, and that ends up determining maybe a kind of finite range of possibilities that I'm aware of that has a kind of insidious potential. What about all the books that I don't see that's presented for me? Not knowing what those books might be a big problem. And I was studying this a little bit with algorithms that are AI-based, operating behind the scenes at Instagram, and newer generations of it, like TikTok. We think these things are kind of stupid and, like people doing dances, but yet TikTok is like a strange company, and operating with new algorithms and with a very different strategy from the previous generation of like Facebook and Instagram. This was explained to me by somebody else. I don't know how accurately I'm actually understanding it, but Instagram, for example, presents all these things primarily with the logic of increasing their user base, connecting as many people to as many others as possible, which then has a net effect of expanding a user base. And then the larger the user base goes, the more they can charge for advertising. On some level, very simple. TikTok, on the other hand, has a very different kind of algorithm that's trying to figure out what it is that you like. And just by monitoring, I guess, your quote engagement. And then once there's some kind of statistical approximation of your interests and values, it keeps feeding you more and more of it. And so it kind of puts you in a kind of attention cycle, which is a very different kind of logic, I think, from what comes before. So it's almost like wrapping a world around you and keeping you there, which potentially also separates us into different worlds of attention where we become more and more distant. So I think what you say is very true. There are some real dangers about automating some degree of subjectivity, even though we might be preserving some autonomy of choice nonetheless. We may not be paying enough attention to what degree of have surrendered.
That's super interesting. And on the flip side, what we were chatting about the other day is what kind of possibilities this might open up to kind of take yourself out of the equation, to go hands off, a little less subjective. We talked about Duchamp, instructional art, and people like Wayne McGregor who are choreographers who have basically said, okay, I'm going to take 25 years of my body movement archive, feed that in, and then be able to generate other kind of dance moves or kind of expand the syntax and language of my archive. And of course, having a 25-year archive of input is also super helpful to this process because it's more directed. It's like a directed search rather than just a complete mashup of anything. So there's probably, great ways that you can use these tools to step aside or just kind of, get another, I think Peter was mentioning this, just like get another way of looking at your own work even.
Yeah, now that we address the dark part, switch over to maybe something a little more optimistic. I mean, just for entirely selfish reasons, there was something so exciting about AI-based methods, which was very similar to the excitement of collaborating with a new person. As we all know, we get so stuck in a rut of the imagination where I'm getting so sick of myself because I can't imagine anything new, and then it takes something from the outside to just wake up the imagination, connect it to new things. And on that level, the AI-based tools seem to be like having like a team of collaborators that's just throwing new content at you that just defamiliarizes one's habits of the imagination. And I found it incredibly stimulating as a defamiliarizing machine. And all the dangers we just previously talked about will always be there, I think, whenever something is entering in from the outside, like how much of our autonomy are we surrendering for the possibility of the new. So I think for me, I feel it's interesting to stay kind of in the middle here on the fence about how dangerous is it? How exciting is it? That try to look on both sides of this because there definitely are some benefits to working with these tools.
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot of cultural institutions that have embraced them and are exploring the possibilities. Like museums are starting to say, if we start to release, thousands and thousands of images of our archive, then like MoMA or the Met, then we kind of, let the public start to access this material in another way, and using AI, they can start to track and see, maybe there's going to be another kind of curatorial model or another way of putting together the work based on these kind of huge data sets rather than a single curator or just a couple of curators. So I think there's other influence that can happen, and we'll see over time what that does. Does that make things more inclusive, or does it ultimately make things less legible? And we'll see. We'll kind of like probably in the next 5 years see the balance.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that's one of the interesting things that is being accelerated. That is the reconsideration of what constitutes an original. I think is a 20th century question. It's like 100 years old. It says, what is that? Andy Warhol's Brillo box, is an original. And I think that had nothing to do with AI. But I think one thing the technologization of appropriation is doing is it is accelerating it to a degree where just by virtue of the scale at which appropriation is happening now, I think there are some new effects socially and politically, and how value is being constructed. And I think institutions are really playing catch up with this right now. Like what constitutes an original that can be collected and have value and so on. So I think this is something that's being formulated right now actively. I think this is a matter for contemporary discourse.
This is a really great point you make, because it also has to do with what was in the archive or the collection to begin with. And that's also being questioned. So you have new ways of reading an archive, but you also have a kind of questioning or reconsideration of what's in the archive to begin with. And I think this is all, creating new new opportunities for historical work to be done, and also for kind of projective work. And I think some of the tools are actually allowing us to look back and go forward at the same time, which is a very interesting moment because, I mean, traditionally you would just say, well, we're going to take the archive and represent it in a certain point of view. It's chronological, it's thematic, it's topical. And now you can start to say, oh, we're going to take the archive and we're going to represent it in a multiplicity of ways with many voices and include things into the archive that weren't there originally. And so I'm finding this like a really, at a kind of like more meta conversation. This is a super interesting moment, whether or not it's only AI or, it's just part of our larger zeitgeist that we're reconsidering these things. But I find that a really wonderful moment that we're in to be able to think about our collections and how one re-sees something, remakes something, re-originates something.
I think there's also an interesting possibility for things in between subjects. And the term that I hear often used now is intersubjectivity. But I think that speaks to something well known, that there is work, there is originality that emerges in between subjects, in between people. And I think this kind of hyper acceleration of appropriation of content, I think produces a much more dense, complex field for intersubjective work, and where the location of where that original emerged from becomes incredibly unclear. But maybe that's not an entirely negative thing, because fetishizing the subject activities of individual geniuses, and I mean, I'd like to see the end of that anyway. So that's not something I want to hang on to too deeply. I mean, I don't know, maybe one thing that's not necessarily directly related is by chance, I read this thing about if you took all the computers and gadgets in the world and added it up and the power they consumed, it amounts to about 3.5% of all carbon emissions in the world, and roughly equivalent to the airline industry. So I think there is a reminder that there is some kind of power consumption problem behind all of this too, that we don't really think enough about. So maybe I could just leave it at that if we want to return to group discussion here.
Yes, I want to maybe thank you for the great discussion, maybe to ask a couple of questions to all of you to wrap up our panel. And maybe it's a bit of a provocation, but it's a question actually that was asked of me when I went to MIT. And the question is, do computers have subjectivity? And maybe if each of you want to say yes or no, and why yes and why no. Do you like computers? I thought it was a very disheartening question when they asked me, but then when I had to answer, it made a lot of sense to me to think about this. Pita, do you want to take it?
Maybe you could take an anonymous poll.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't know that I would look at it quite that way, because I think subjectivity is not a machinic procedure. That suggests that it is a subject that has some kind of, let's say inner life. So I don't think that's the right terminology for me, but I would like to jump back into the discussion with David and Devyn, that this idea of intersubjectivity, I think is maybe where the exchange occurs more usefully and productively between, let's say, human intelligence and machine intelligence, and their discrepancies or discorrelations. So the idea of intersubjectivity is maybe a good definition for where architecture actually lives, that architecture really is about intersubjectivity, I think, and because it's a social process and a cultural process, so a cultural construct. So I also think that in a way, you could say that architecture lives in the space between disciplines, as David's maybe implying. I don't know if that's where you're going with that, but I think that that's where these exchanges can be very productive. And also, the other question brought up about digital waste is a concern when you start. We do have to take into account that the cloud is on the ground. The cloud is not in the sky. The cloud is on the ground, and the cloud is using up a lot of energy. So, and there is also an enormous amount of electronic waste being produced. So the idea that we have endless resource and computation, I think, needs to be challenged as well. And maybe we need to be more intelligent in the way in which we engage these processes.
Thank you, Peter. Ramiro, do you have an opinion about computers and their ability to display, if possible, subjectivity through this AI?
Not yet. Well, I love computers and I hate computers, but not yet, clearly, I think. It's funny that question made me think of James Lovelock, his latest book, The Novacene, which he's already speculating, past the Anthropocene, and identifying electric life as a thing that takes up consciousness as the universe's way to know itself. So I think we're in the latent stages of that, perhaps, but I think it's coming.
This question was actually asked of me from Neri Oxman. Florencia, do you want to have maybe the last word about computers? And so
me, after I shown paint and silk screen and all digital stuff, yes, why not? I think yes, because I think the world of taste and the world of opinions and the world of feelings has invaded social media. So I would have to say that it's creating some sort of subjectivity that it's affecting everybody. Somehow there's that, almost like you think of something, you Google something, it appears to you. I mean, it's talking to you. I mean, there's a little bit of almost it has an opinion with you. I don't think it's good, of course. I see that this kind of negativity in a way. I was going to borrow, like Peter did from David, this intersubjectivity, which I think this is what we're doing, with this kind of feedback and exchange. It's something that is in between. And so I think, I think that, yes, the answer would be is creating a subjectivity that is related to social media. I mean, that's, I think, is the way in which it enters through taste and opinion, and it's affecting opinion. Look at our election cycle. I mean, look at what it's doing. So I would say, unfortunately, yes.
So thank you, Florencia. This concludes our panel number 2 for graphic. Thank you, Florencia, Ramiro, Devyn, David, and Peter for the fantastic insights on AI. I would like to introduce Damjan, who will be the moderator of panel number 3, simulators. Thank you.
Hello and welcome, everyone. This is panel number 3, and I will share my screen just shortly. So the panel number 3 is called Simulators. My name is Damjan Jovanovic, and I will be moderating this panel, which is the name of which is kind of a difficult term, and we might get into it at one point later. But first, let's address a little bit the BEAST as a project. The BEAST is a project where the institutional memory becomes contaminated by the data hoarding logic of online platforms in order to produce new systems of value. This might be a mode of seeing and curation appropriate for the immense complexity of today. In many ways, each of our panelists work through non-standard modes of perception, through film, animation, AI, video games, event, or body. All of these are in some ways related to the hybrid logic of simulation as a way of responding to complexity. These modes of production constitute design in an expanded sense. In the project, there is a focus on world making, new modes of expression, and new ordering systems. Let me briefly introduce the fantastic panel and participants. So Hernán Díaz Alonso is a director of SCI-Arc and principal of the Los Angeles-based architectural office HDAX, which is a multidisciplinary practice that works at the intersection of design, animation, interactive environments, and radical architectural explorations. Hernán is also a curator of this show. Natou is an art director, makeup artist, educator, and architectural designer based in Los Angeles. She's design faculty at SCI-Arc, and her works aims to reestablish and challenge the idea of cosmetics in architecture. Liam Young runs the fiction and entertainment postgraduate program at SCI-Arc. His work operates in the spaces between design, fiction, and futures, and explores the possibilities of fantastic, speculative, and imaginary urbanisms. Carol Klein is an architect and co-director of Klein. She's design faculty at SCI-Arc, and her work explores craft and precision and the evolution of design expertise in the digital age, as well as the persistence of the role of the designer in contemporary culture. Myself, Damjan Jovanovic, I'm design faculty at SCI-Arc and a co-founder of Lifeforms.io, which is a transdisciplinary design studio that sees the world through the emergent media of AI, simulation, and video games. And last but not least, Michael Casey Rehm is a designer and algorithmic consultant based in Los Angeles. He's the principal of Studio Kinch, and he runs the architectural technologies program at SCI-Arc. And he's also responsible for the design of the Beast. So when we move through the latent space of the Beast, we see that the Beast is a machine for producing the new. On the other hand, the Beast is also a strange map of what we could call Planet SCI-Arc. It is a brain. It is a Mnemosine atlas, or even, we could say, the Freudian id of the school. We also know that software is never only a tool, but presents us with a new way to see and engage the world. It kind of molds us and produces us as people. What can we learn today from the Beast? So I prepared kind of 3 general questions for the panel, and I just want to kind of go through them briefly before we enter the discussion. For Natou and then Hernán, we live in a time where individual expression is mediated through machines, framed by platforms, and captured through tracking technologies. In the age of AI, the body is a site and a battlefield of freedom. How do we resist, engage, and move forward? And for Liam and Casey, we are participating in a Cambrian explosion of new narratives. And it has never been easier to make fully convincing worlds, myths, and cosmologies. AI, with its endless capacity for artifice, looks to massively accelerate this condition. How do you see AI influencing your own work? And for Karel and Casey, interpretations of AI as a generative power go anywhere from full-blown religious belief to reducing AI to kind of a brute force statistical model that can only repeat the all too human bias of a data set. So between the hype and disbelief, how do you see the question of AI agency and so-called creativity? So I wanted to kind of just stop sharing and maybe enter into the conversation. And we don't have to follow any order, but maybe we can, or we could, maybe Hernán and Natou, you can respond first to the question.
I'm happy to go first. Well, A pleasure to be with all of you here. It's always fun to have these kind of conversations in which I think one way or another we all kind of trying to figure it out, certain certainties, which I think probably underneath we all are kind of in a territory in which probably ambiguity or discomfort with any of this position is the most natural state. In the larger context, to think of the notion of exhibition and this version of the exhibitions and the version that will come. For me, it's important to establish that, and I think it relates to your question specifically, and I get to in a minute, that this is not operating with the idea that is to pass a clear judgment. It's more to understand that this is kind of a reality and a territory in which we all operate, and we try to figure it out how to navigate this, which I think it has to do with the reshaping of individuality, authorship, and anything that has to do historically with creativity. And one could argue that fundamentally never changed, but it changed the means how we communicate. I think it has been established in some of the previous panels, and I think this always has been the case in architecture and design and any creative field. You never operate in an autonomous way. You always are in a mass of contamination, and you always kind of a dialogue. And the notion of originality is always an aspiration, but almost with a certainty that cannot be achieved. In a way, you can never operate in a context. So, particularly with the question that you're posing to Natou and myself, it's kind of interesting because I've been always struggling with that conversation between the body, and sometimes we separate the body from the idea of the humanity or the humanism of it. And I always think that any creative endeavor is fundamentally humanist, despite all the technological apparatus that we surround with. But I have to say, to me, how do you resist to engage? I think it's all part of the same. I think you resist and engage, and you engage by resisting, and you resist by engaging, and make it part of it. Specifically in terms of the body, you define it as a battlefield, which I think is an interesting way to put it. I always have to say that I always see the relation of the body in relation to design as a confrontational one. I never saw it, and I never see it, and I don't see it now, as a way to create a level of comfort, but it's more about the notion of how it keeps challenging. Now, the body, it can take many dimensions. Are we talking, again, the body in an anthropomorphic sense? Or we talking the body of the work? Or we talking of the pieces that we produce as the body? Or we take the versions that the beast keep mutating as the body? And we can argue there's all of them. And the part that they think can moving from one territory to another. And I think that applies to all of us. I mean, it's like the old Monty Python joke. We are all individuals. Yes, we are all individuals. I am not. So there is always this problem of the notion of individuality and the collective, which I think is very much at the center of this. So to me, always in relation with the condition of technology, in particular in the case of in this time with artificial intelligence and machine learning, whatever it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or it will be 10 years from now, the debate will be at the center of it. And I think is to propagate and to keep that debate alive and burning what it makes it. So I'm not so sure that we need to take absolute positions. I think we all presume to operate with that. And certainly in that sense, I'm a very old school and dinosaur in relation to the technology, because I still see it as a way to enhance and engage the possibility of authorship, or the possibility of individuality, accepting that individuality is almost impossible to achieve. And as I said, as part of the same relation with the body, which is, I think you have multiple versions. So I'll stop now, because probably Natou has something way more interesting to say than what I just did.
No, Hernán, thank you. I think I agree. I think the sort of way you posed the question, Damjan, is really interesting. This idea of the sort of again, the body as a battlefield. I think when it comes to thinking about the body, I guess in my own, I guess, opinion. I think I'm thinking about the body and the sort of like anthropomorphic nature of it. And so when it comes to sort of how the body relates to AI, I think the question becomes like, or it's sort of engaging with it. I think it becomes a question of again, like letting go of the sort of individuality that we all possess, because I think machines don't necessarily understand that yet, right? And so it's more about, you know, the machine is sort of going to understand the body as a what and not a who, right? And so the questions of like identity and things like that kind of become blurred or kind of like thrown, you know, or the sort of earlier in an earlier conversation is that, you know, this idea of sort of willpower and being able to like drive the result of it, I think becomes less expected, but I think that, or I guess less, what's the word, less predictable, but I think that in and of itself gives us the space to start to imagine like different types of bodies and different types of I guess, body constitution. And I think like that then leads to like, you know, questions of like, you know, maybe opening sort of like understanding for physical representation of the self or of an ideology or something.
Or the politics, right, of the self.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. I never thought about this question that you guys mentioned, that there could be a doubling or tripling of the notion of the body. I merely thought about just the body as we kind of understand it, but I think it's a really interesting idea to connect this to the body of work and kind of the larger ideas of politics, and to scale that up. But specifically, I also think that the question of scale also becomes really interesting when we talk about AI and how that influences the design process. And maybe that was the question also for Liam and Casey, this idea of kind of world making and operating on the planetary scale and working with this kind of large scale ideas, and how that becomes transformed, or if it becomes transformed in any way through what we, you know, the state of the art that we are kind of dealing with right now. And maybe Liam, if you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when we're dealing with the scales and complexities of the planet, AI becomes, you know, a shorthand for cutting through some of that noise, and identifying stories and patterns and narratives that kind of make sense of all of that mess. But I guess what I wanted to get into in response to your question was the act of world making and its relationship to the fictions and narratives we tell about technology. It's impossible to separate technology from culture. And so often with emerging tech like AI, driverless cars, drones, you know, whatever smart city tech you want to substitute here, you know, these are things that arrive at us faster than our cultural capacity to understand what they might mean has. So the role of world building, scaffolding stories, imagining fiction, speculative futures around these systems is actually really critical, because it helps us to start to understand what these things might mean for us. You know, in many ways, we don't even realize it, but AI is kind of bubbling behind the scenes of so much of our life already. It's not necessarily something of a future. Yet the dominant narratives through which we talk about it, the fictions we tell about AI are generally like Terminators and Blade Runners and cyborgs and androids running out of control. So what we try and do with our work, I guess, is find ways to connect audiences and the public to the reality of what AI is. What does a sci-fi film look like with kind of, you know, latent AI, you know, behind the scenes of the banking network? How does that become a compelling story? Or AI managing our water or our power or our traffic grid? What does that mean in a narrative sense? How do we get people excited about the realities of that kind of AI? We did a film called Soul City Machine, where we built a chatbot and AI trained on urban operating protocols. And the film is really about how people might interface and talk to their city. What does it mean to transfer the same ways that we talk to an AI like Alexa or Microsoft Cortana or Siri? And how do we have a meaningful conversation with our city, with our building, with our house, with an autonomous shipping crane, with a giant, massive container ship stuck in the middle of Suez Canal? I think those kind of stories actually become really interesting, not just in and of themselves, but because these fictions actually shape and define the way that we understand these technologies and what they mean to us.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting also question or a position, let's say, when we think about like the proliferation of fictions and the kind of maybe the excess of fictions that we are kind of immersed in. And I think these fictions, they're also about scale in a way. They go from the kind of the body scale, the idea of politics, all the way to the scale of the planet. And it's also interesting, I think, to think like how different stories gain traction or gain kind of acceptance, like everything from like conspiracy theories to challenging science to kind of understanding AI in a way that becomes problematic, I think. And maybe if you, Casey, if you could shed some light on that idea of how you see fictioning of AI and this idea of when we talk about AI, sometimes we interrupt, we kind of think of it as a human or think of it as some kind of hidden like agency or something like this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think when I met with all of the panel moderators to kind of discuss it, I was actually trying to kind of dampen the AI-related conversation because I think it does tend towards this space of kind of comparing it to kind of a human intelligence, like the types of narrow intelligences, the types of intelligent agencies that we're working with, like the trying to compare them to the kind of Turing test, like replacing human creativity idea of AI is not particularly interesting. It's also not what these machines do that's interesting, right? Like they kind of failed by that marker, but that's a kind of useless marker to measure failure by. I mean, I think the things that like Liam's discussing is really where this becomes more interesting. Also what kind of frames the design of the show. And I think this came up a lot in the first panel as well. Like I really love the discussion about the kind of the consuming of data and kind of reproducing some kind of modified versions of it, right? Like this, I like Ferda's quote about the graphic versus the image versus the graphic. And really where this stuff has value to me is in kind of conceptual questions around like automation, kind of amplifying consumption, amplifying production, the kind of trap of inductive stagnation that I just kind of iterated that, these machines can make endless versions of the things that it's seen, but it always looks like basically the thing that it's seen, right? Because they're operating on this kind of known data set or a priori data set in this like very constrained space. But the power that it really has is it's able to begin to consume through an alternative perceptual model to our own. And I think thinking about the network as perceptual models is really relevant. And certainly there's a lot written on that from people like Matteo Pasquinelli and with his like no scope essays, kind of really hits at that. But it's a tool that allows us to begin to engage the ubiquity of data and the vastness of data and begin to construct value on it, turn it into information, allow us to see patterns and things that we can't see patterns before, right? And so its utility in like ordering and organizing is super obvious. And I think the show kind of reflects that. Like we're using the show in a way to create this archival map of both the kind of institutional aesthetic set and then the kind of like unknowably vast social media idea about what architecture would be. And by beginning to compare and visually just like intuitively register the differences between those, right? Like that's for me more interesting than the individual images within the grid. I think, whether or not one of those, and again, like part of the problem with the show, of course, is this is the very worst data set that you could train a network on. It's super diverse, super small. Like it's, you would never, it's the same kind of model that can make the deep fake, like photoreal faces, but this machine's never going to get that good because we're kind of feeding it this uncurated, well, initially curated, but super heterogeneously curated thing. But then now, as it's moving forward the next couple of days, this uncurated thing So for me, it's more interesting to start to see how the machine perceives patterns and relationships between like this kind of unknowable space of social media, and how that relates to what we think of as like, the artisanal authorship, right? Which is, is the same kind of or the same kind of application we see in the things of like their use in terms of shaping governance and shaping, the way we inhabit cities now, like more and more with like the integration of kind of smart technology into the kind of rezoning and surveillance and criminal protection. And so I think that's exactly where like Liam is trying to begin to like make that legible, because that's a kind of very real territory that these things are being applied and having impact in our lives right now, but maybe underrepresented because of this, kind of knee-jerk reaction to try to want some form of, Renaissance creativity or innovation from the machine, right?
Right. I think to me, this is another like major question that always comes back in these discussions, this idea of like creativity and maybe talking about different understandings and different interpretations of the generative power of AI and how that removes agency or kind of displaces agency. And I wanted to ask Karel, what was your kind of idea about this?
Well, Damjan, I was actually, in thinking about the relation to creativity, if you don't mind, I'll back up because I was very interested in the provocation that you made about the brain and then about Freud in a sense, so that, perhaps we're talking about a kind of psychology of AI. And if I can talk about that a bit, I think I can get to perhaps what I find kind of interesting about what it can do, not necessarily as a kind of collaborator, but how you can kind of skim off a kind of aspect of it. But what Freud would say about art is that art is the kind of manifestation of the artist's pathology, or he would say that art is a symptom of a kind of psychopathology. I was reading this article recently about by a guy named James Hillman, who's a psychologist, called The Practice of Beauty. And the article is about the repression of beauty and a kind of academic or especially perhaps the Academy's repression of beauty. And he uses the kind of language of mythology and reminds us of the myth of Aphrodite. And as you know, she was born of the kind of foam that kind of surrounded the kind of cut off genitals of Uranus. Kronos cut them off, threw them in the sea. The sea bubbled up and she emerged from it. And I think what's kind of fascinating about that as a kind of analogy, perhaps, is the kind of understanding that beauty, thinking about beauty, that beauty is always immediate, always on display, always perceptible, always on the surface. So it manifests on the surface. So this foam and her emergence is on the surface of this kind of unfathomable depth of this ocean. And I think that's what's kind of fascinating to me about, or I get the sense that this AI is doing a kind of work of manifesting this kind of perceptible beauty in a sense, and it's kind of foaming, it's kind of on the surface. It especially in this kind of StyleGAN place, it's all image, it's all visual, and it's all, like David Rue was saying earlier, kind of defamiliarization machine. But it's also kind of this other kind of other kinds of machine of other kinds of perceptions too. But getting back to kind of perhaps the psychopathology, Hillman also writes about a kind of moment of repression of beauty. And he speaks about narcissus, this kind of disorder that's characterized by a desire turning itself inward. And he describes it as there being no way to kind of access, because of this repression, the beauty outside of yourself in the world, this kind of manifestation of beauty outside of yourself. And so you turn inward on yourself, towards yourself, and point desire that way. And I think it's also a kind of curious analogy that AI is perhaps this kind of embodiment of this narcissistic disorder, this kind of constant making of beauty in the sense that it's very inward and kind of very hermetic and very other of the world in a sense. It's a kind of its own world. And so I think to kind of address the kind of my interest with it in terms of creativity, it has something to do with that. It has something to do with this kind of making of this kind of constant making of this kind of perception of beauty. This perhaps is a kind of, if it has this relationship to repressed beauty, it's this kind of narcissistic manifestation of like constant beauty anyway. And so I'm curious about that. I'm curious about kind of being opportunistic with its ability to be like that.
That is really, oh, sorry, Natou, you can go.
No, I was just going to say, I think, Karel, that's really interesting to bring that up, because I think the sort of system taking feedback from social media and engaging with that is like sort of driving or sort of opening up that sort of narcissistic system, right? To be able to intake influence based off of how people are interacting with it. And that is sort of altering the results and then creating this sort of new beauty, right? Based off of input from you or engagement, I guess.
And perhaps it is a different, it's a beauty that looks different. And perhaps this is this defamiliarization aspect of it. So because it is not quite taking, again, it's this kind of inability to access beauty outside of, and so there's this kind of turning inward and finding beauty inside, the pointing of the desire inward. And so it becomes strange. It becomes unusual in that it's not necessarily recognizable in the way that we, perhaps in a less repressed kind of way, can kind of find beauty collectively outside, right?
Yeah, it's really awesome that we are talking about beauty. I think this is one of the things that the Bestia really shows is that like the kind of the commitment of SCI-Arc to this idea of kind of visual and representational project, which is really maybe at its essence about like seeking liberation and seeking beauty in some ways. But I'd like to hear also from everyone about like, how did you find something maybe surprising when you looked at results that were produced, or something surprising or something beautiful, or something liberating, or something that kind of moved a bit when you looked at the results produced through the machine? I think to me that was one of the questions from the previous panel that I found like really interesting, and I think maybe we could just have a collective conversation around that, and also in the relation to beauty, which I think is kind of a contested and really amazingly complex idea to even talk about. Maybe Natou, you can tell us a bit, about that.
I guess to answer your first question, I think what I found the most surprising, that the content I submitted was kind of very, very different. And so the results were a little funky, but, I think what I found the most intriguing was actually the text that was generated. I took some screenshots of the ones that, it weirdly it almost read like, I know it was based off of my writing and sort of my captions and stuff, but it was almost too similar. Like some of the things I was like, wow, that's actually very profound. Like, I don't know. I don't know if that's just me, but it was pretty interesting. I think maybe the one that I found the most interesting is, hold on, let me find it. This one, a close-up of a person holding an umbrella. When faced with with such a challenge, sometimes, in quotations, I look forward to the challenges that are ahead, whether it's creating community as a female artist in a hostile and ignorant world. The world needs us. It needs to have us. It needs us more. It needs us more.
Wow, that's really, really profound. Casey, what do you think about this? This is like...
Again, it's a very clever parrot, you know? Yeah. I mean, that's ultimately what we're looking at. Like, it's found a probability of the way Natou strings the words together, right? And then it's replicating those probable character-to-character relationships. And then, there, you know, there's a darker question about then, like, is any thought more than a kind of probabilistic assemblage of, you know, characters or anything? But I think that's not a productive conversation.
Hernán, what do you think? Is there more than probability?
I hope so. I don't know. To me, what was surprising is the different evolution when you go through the process from looking for yourself. And I have to say, I had the benefit to see both versions. And I think the experience was different. In the first version, there was a frame with frozen image, with a frozen image from each of the author. And then on the bottom, you have the beast, Bestia, doing its thing. So it was a different thing. It was more like an exercise. Where is Waldo? They were trying to find the things. In the current version, which is all more interactive, it's a different one. So in a way, to me, it was an interesting experience. And maybe this relate with the psychology and therapy about let it go and to understand that you cannot control everything. And some moment you stop for looking where you can recognize and you start to look for more what new clues start to appear and what that fed into the process that you go through. This is something that I'm personally fascinated in the way that music operates, the capacity to, the way the evolution of music to producing and sampling and digitalization and layering, which is something in architecture and the design we always struggle with. Maybe some kind of a much more conventional way to think about the mechanism of creativity. So to me, that was surprising into my own psychology. I mean, like how you go from first try to find traces of individuality, and then you start to immerse what you start to produce, and you start to say, okay, how I can take that and reappropriate again and feed it again. So to me, at the bottom or at the center, at least when we started the project, was that idea. Like, I mean, claim yourself, lose yourself, reclaim yourself, lose yourself. So maybe again to go into kind of an Argentinian, so psychoanalysis comes is part of the issue. But it's an interesting thing. It's about the notion of controlling, which is what we all driven as creative and designers. So the notion then to start to understand that you cannot control and that you're creating a partnership with the evolution of the technology in which you keep changing roles about who is in control. And I think we are in a roller coaster. It's not going to stop. I think we're going to keep negotiating that for years to come.
And I was curious what Liam thinks about this question of beauty and surprise.
Yeah, I mean, the aesthetic of our project borrows so heavily from like Hollywood sci-fi aesthetic of what the future is supposed to look like, right? Like quite deliberately, you know, there's speculative designers that spend a lot of time trying to invent a new aesthetic language for the future, whereas we kind of lean heavily into an established pop cultural understanding of what the future is supposed to look like. The people we collaborate with are all in the VFX industry in LA and so on. So seeing our digital futures smeared together into like, you know, weird furry digital puppy dogs, like the one behind Casey, was interesting, right? Because this is the new aesthetic of our shared AI future, is this kind of Ganified, fuzzy, furry kind of thing. So to see that at an urban scale, with our own kind of framing and editing, pacing, and language was super weird. But yeah, I think what it's indicative of is that the use of these tools has started to define a particular style, a particular aesthetic, a particular way that we now see our aesthetic future which is super interesting. I don't know how long it's going to last, right? Like, I think we're already writing better code, more sophisticated software that's moving beyond the GAN aesthetic that we've become so used to across the last 3 years, 5 years.
Right.
So I think we've already, like, nothing dates like images of the future, right? And I think the beast is already on its way out in a way, which is great, which I think that's part of its design,
Planned obsolescence.
Well, aesthetic evolving at the rate of Moore's law, or the latest software update, or whenever Casey gets some new funding to rewrite the code base. I think that's kind of interesting, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like specifically why we thought about it more of an archive this time. Was this is like a kind of certain frame of a certain moment of like what the software can do right now, and like what's happening both like in the institution and on the internet. Right? Yeah, because I mean, I think this aesthetic, I think, is already maybe past its last legs on social media. But maybe to Hernán's point too, I think there are things in here that I start to get interested in, and I think going back to the first panel, like I could see starting to introduce one of the outputs of this as a kind of priors now for constructing like a new value set within my project. Like maybe I can build something off of some of the output of this thing in the future, but certainly the thing as itself is maybe less interesting.
Maybe I also wanted to raise the question for Karel as well, of this maybe transitioning from the image-based aesthetics to what we may kind of name model-based approach to AI, and kind of getting into this idea of models a little bit, which I think is lurking in the background of all of these discussions, are I think basically new ways of modeling the world.
Technically, that's a question for Casey, but so I don't think I could answer that question technically, except that I was thinking in terms of this idea that this aesthetic is kind of on its way out. I think that's true in a way, but I think it's in terms of its novelty in a sense. So I think there are ways to kind of still kind of hack at it or hack it so that it can, become more sophisticated or evolve, or you undermine this kind of tendency, this aesthetic tendency, so that so I don't know if it's just about kind of the next thing replacing the old thing, as much as it might be about kind of digging a little bit deeper in a sense, although that's perhaps not the right kind of figure of speech, because I don't know, it sounds kind of oddly stubborn in a way. And but I think if there was a kind of question about modeling, it may have something to do with that too. It may be about kind of thinking about the ways in which you kind of hack at tools or hack at things, rather than kind of finding necessarily, I mean, there's always going to be the next code, and there's always going to be this kind of rapid evolution of this, always, as if this has always been around. Like Liam said, the past 3 years? 3 years is nothing. And the fact that it's kind of occupies our kind of collective consciousness in this kind of way is astounding. So that it will kind of rapidly change. But I think perhaps there's two parts of the answer to the question in this kind of straightforward way, which is that there'll probably be kind of some really good code that's written that can solve the modeling problem. But I also think there's a relationship to folding the tools and hacking the tools so that you can get at it perhaps in ways that you bring your own expertise to it in a sense, right?
It's also, I think, the question of models in a way that, mental models of the self or kind of models of the world, but also models of AI. And this was, I think, maybe what was behind all these questions, at least from my understanding, was these three layers maybe of modeling. What Natou and Hernán were talking about was, I think, how we model the self and how we respond to that new kind of challenge that is thrown through technology. And I think in Liam's case that, this idea that the world, we know the world through models in a way, and through understanding, through kind of these kind of deep models or cosmologies, and how we could intervene, within that as designers, I think. And I think also in Casey's and Karel's way, I think that the model is literally a model of computation that kind of includes the, all the biases, all the control points and everything that we know or don't know. I think it's kind of what is behind that. But I just want to say thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this discussion. And next up is the spatial panel, which is moderated by Matthew Au.
My name is Matthew Au, and I will be moderating the next 45 minutes. This panel gathers together a motley crew of architects and faculty under the Bestia AI assigned category spatial. As discussed in the previous panels, each of the participants were asked to submit a large collection of images, video, and/or text, indiscriminate of finish or quality, to fold into the data set consumed by the Bestia. For the sake of alignment, each participant was placed into 4 categories based on the artifacts submitted. Each of the participants here either fit precisely within some notion of what might be described as spatial, or simply didn't fit into the other 3 categories. As I introduce our panelists, we'll see a sample of the artifacts they submitted. So Herwig Baumgartner is the coordinator of applied studies and design faculty at SCI-Arc. He is the principal and co-founder, along with Scott Arui, of the Los Angeles-based practice B+U. Margaret Griffin and John Enright are the founding partners of Griffin Enright Architects. John Enright is the Vice Director and Chief Academic Officer of SCI-Arc and former chair of the undergraduate program. Margaret Griffin is the Faculty of Design in both the graduate and undergraduate programs. Suming Han is the principal of Suming Han Design and teaches both design studio and applied studies at SCI-Arc. Mira Henry is a design studio and visual studies faculty, as well as the coordinator of the DID program. She is founding partner of Current Interest with me, Matthew Au, who also I teach design studio and visual studies in the MARC 1 graduate program. So notable to the, I'll go ahead and stop this share. So notable to the samples submitted by the participants and surprisingly distinct from the other categories is their status as photographs of things actualized in the physical world, whether the drywalled interior of a house, a wood-slatted pavilion, a vacuum-formed exhibition object, or a stuccoed wall mock-up. We might question whether we consider these artifacts that enter into the collection images of things that we consider spatial, or if we consider the images themselves as spatial. And how do we read spatial images anyways? To begin, I'd like us each to describe some of the artifacts submitted to the exhibition, perhaps beginning with Margaret and John, and then followed by Suming.
Sure. Our artifacts were actually primarily photographs that spanned 20 years worth of built work. So they were a variety of interior and exterior photographs that essentially images that document our built work.
Suming, do you want to jump in?
Okay, yeah, I was waiting for John too. Okay, thank you very much. The work that I submitted was about 2 pavilion installation that was done. Is built. So I specifically picked a very physical and fabricated kind of project specifically for this submission, because I thought it would be really interesting to kind of see, because this AI-trained imageries are actually image-based kind of products at the end. But I thought it would be really interesting to see how the kind of spatial qualities that from actual physical architectural spaces can be learned by machine and reproduce that. And I think I'm super interested in that aspect. And by looking at the resulting kind of images, they're also very spatial. So I thought that was kind of a very interesting aspect. Yeah.
Then maybe Herwig, do you want to jump in, and then Mira, and then we can kind of discuss some of the qualities of these things.
Yeah, so when Casey asked us, he said he wanted to have all these hundreds of images, and we were like, well, we did a lot of videos, those are mostly like narrative. And so this was kind of a perfect kind of thing, because you have one video, it has obviously lots of images. But when we picked these different videos, they purposely had a mixture of as diverse of a project as we could find. So that it goes anything from like a chair to an installation to a large scale kind of design. So some of it is physical only, and others is purely digital. So I mean, I was curious to kind of see what's going to happen to that mashup. That's the beast is going to do with those things, and it's fascinating actually how it's trying to match things that don't really get together, and what's coming out of it on the other side. So that's what we did.
Well, I don't really fully know. I think a lot of things went into the file that ended up turning into this. But all of the projects, all the images that went in, I would say most of them were all much like Suman described, quite physical. I love the way you described it, actually, Suman, like these kind of robust physical objects. I think that's mostly what we do. So that's what we put in, and they're all photographs of those things, either model or physical, full-scale mock-ups, or a new house we just worked on, an interior project. So all things that in some ways have been instantiated in the world, which I think is quite interesting. I mean, certainly not across all of the other panels. There's plenty of other projects that have been instantiated in the world at full scale that were represented, but it does seem like one of the things that glues this group together. Or yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I guess that to maybe part of my curiosity with this group and how what I, at least in my own mind, sees it as somewhat like a divergent set of practices, right? Very different in what we might consider our own aesthetics. There does seem to be around the images that we collect, things that have already been built. And so what that means, or at least from what I'm understanding that to mean, is that we are documenting things that have been constructed already. Taking images of things that might be different than what we might choose to photograph as like a rendering, or not photograph, but choose to produce as a rendering. So there might be some interiors or material compositions or other things like that. And I'm just curious as to like, in Margaret, as you were saying, you brought in like 20 years of built work. That is a lot. That's a lot of photographs of, I could imagine, window details. I could imagine corners. I could imagine handrails, things like that we might see as sort of or often take for granted, and the things that we might produce otherwise in like a different way of production or different form of documentation. And maybe you can expand a little bit on that 20-year set of images.
Well, in a way, it's kind of like just from an encyclopedic kind of take of our work. What's fascinating when you do built work is the way that it gets out into the world is primarily through photographs, also through video, like Herwig's talking about, but unless someone can go visit the project, the photographic image of the project becomes like really critical. And actually, all the photographs that we have of our work are highly constructed, highly, like very specific views, very specifically framed. And so in a way, they're as constructed as any like abstract image, let's say, even though they're of a real space. So we thought this would be an interesting thing to use for that reason, and get a different result.
Yeah, it's very different than, I mean, I was listening to some of the earlier panels and someone was talking about models, you know, and purposely showing models kind of as objects. And when you photograph architecture, it's very different. Like I'm looking at, we took up screenshots of our background, like you see blue sky a lot, you know, because these are like, these images pop up, like I'm looking for patterns of some differentiation, particularly at the end of the kind of algorithmic smorgasbord. And they're hard to find. Margaret is way better at finding our stuff than I am. I'm like, what is that thing? And she's like, no, don't you know, you can see that corner. But what she's saying, and I'm sure it's the same for everyone, and I didn't quite understand our commonality of that. Maybe most of us showed built things or things in the real environment, but it is really true, as you all know. I mean, the photographs of even what you were, Matthew, when you were showing the installation that Mira did, I mean, that's a highly composed image. A beautiful image, but it's highly purposeful, and you can tell by the author is already editing what one sees, right? And as Margaret says, when projects are photographed, I mean, this is a highly curated thing. It doesn't have to be, but typically it is with our work. And what I think is finally interesting at the end of the day is. Turns out that doesn't really, Casey's algorithm is so powerful that you can't resist it. And no one, what this whole thing proves is I don't think anybody's work can resist that, that blender in my mind. I mean, there's some differentiation, but it's highly powerful and kind of humbling. And then I had to just say this, and I'll shut up, but only Hernán would do an exhibit and invite all these wonderful people and then not really show our work. And he's not here right now, so that's for him, but it's on tape, so he'll see it later.
On some of these videos, so how many videos did you actually submit? You just submit like 3 videos?
We had like 5. We have 5 videos of everything. So.
Okay.
So there's 5 projects, 5 videos.
And are they mostly walking around? Are they catching other things, or is it like focused on a single installation, or is it or a chair or a furniture piece, or is it kind of a little bit a wandering eye?
It's a little bit of different things. I mean, if you, as you guys just mentioned, if you photograph real things, then it's highly staged, right? So the same is true with videotaping it. You're trying to tell a story. Mostly. And so, you know, as you're piecing your storyboard together, that makes the kind of sequences and how you show it and what you show it. But what I found really interesting about this category, also the spatial, is like that the AI is at odds with the spatial. I always thought, you know, it's the one thing that it is really struggling with. It's very good with the image, and I was thinking, you know, it's like, what are some, the spatial architecture that's powerful and surprising. How do you capture that? You know, it's very difficult, as John was saying, to actually even photograph it. You know, you have to kind of be in it. You know, a video sometimes helps a little bit with it, but it doesn't really explain a certain kind of wow moments or like emotions that you have when you're in a certain type of space, right? And so it's logical that the AI would have a hard time with that, because it is not something that's easily explained in pixels. And so, and I do think actually that this group of people, randomly assorted or not, actually has a lot in common on that level. I think there's a real deep interest in spatiality and, very different styles of spatiality or expressions of spatiality. But there is a sense of I think, exploration and surprise of interiority and exteriority that I think we do kind of all share, and so I think on that level, it's quite an interesting group, and I am still hoping, and we are toying with AI in the office as well, but like I'm still hoping to find actually a way how to utilize this beyond the image, and it has been proven really, really, really difficult to say the least.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I found really fascinating when I looked at ours, and I don't know if you guys might feel the same way, but so like in the beginning, you could read a depth of space in the images, you could read a perspective, then they became a kind of flattening, and then it turned into objects. And then I noticed also when we looked at some of the other ones, like for instance, the group that was characterized as objects, I noticed that theirs started out as objects, then it got flattened, then it turned into space in a way. Like what I think was interesting about these different categories that have been set up is that and to me, there is recognizability in it. It's not like you can totally recognize, like when Su Min's project has like invaded another one, like you can recognize the mashups even, which I don't know. I think it creates like these cyborgs or something that I find super interesting.
Su Min, so you described a little bit this process of originally this project had been a proposal, a digital proposal, a script, and then you built it and fabricated, and you wanted to submit the fabricated object and maybe a lot of the additional images that went along with that, and then it ultimately was photographed again. So it's gone through multiple changes, or at least perhaps in the way that you've described it, it's gone through multiple changes. General question, would you consider your work spatial prior to being placed into this group? Or is there some other aspect to the work, either getting built or not getting built, that you believe in?
Yeah, I'm actually very happy that I'm in a group of spatial, because I'm normally, my work, even if it's digital, very image-based work, I have been always trying to look at the three-dimensionality of geometries, even if it's digital, or even I'm looking at 2D drawings, 2D images. They kind of give a really interesting inspiration to you in the back of your mind. You can understand it in depth. And I think all this, all the group of people we saw today have that kind of ability, like to really look at images, flat images, but really understand the three-dimensional. So I have been really trying to do that and create also images to kind of communicate the three-dimensionality and even some kind of 3D geometries. Maybe they're very conceptual, trying to understand it as architectural kind of usable kind of spaces. So maybe the ones that I submitted, actually, if we just look at their digital forms, they can be just an object. They don't look like any room or any house. There's really no typical window frame or door frame or something like that. But they are built in that scale and size, and in that context, they are a part of architecture, and it becomes architectural spaces. So I'm quite interested in I was really amazed by the AI produced version of these because they still look like that in that scale. It doesn't look like objects anymore. Maybe it's also because of so many green grasses around it, so it looks like a landscape pieces. But yeah, the actual digital models itself, they were very, very object-based, yeah. But thank you for the question, yeah.
Mira, do you think our work is spatial?
I think, yes, I think our work is very spatial, but I actually don't think we work that way. I actually think that we work in a very, I think we're trying to define a way of stacking space. So stacking space, which is kind of a flat way of thinking about how space can be sort of designed and kind of seen and perceived. So, and I think I'm always, I don't know, in the project, the little house we just did, I was always surprised at how dimensional all that is, even though it was sort of imagined in some ways as the kind of a set of spaces that could stack, and in that way kind of composed in a very flat manner. I think most of the photographs of spaces that, and Margaret, to your point too, like when you come in, when you take the photograph of the project, what is it that you're taking a picture of? And I was realizing that when I was taking the pictures, the ones that I was most, or directing the photographer to take pictures of a series of projects, it was always the ones that were like nearly flat, not completely, but like nearly elevational. This was something that it seemed like it was a part of the way that things were designed, and also echoed a little bit the way that they were felt in space. At the same time, there was other experience of them in 3 dimensions, which is really lovely to and really powerful. And Margaret and I are teaching together, so she just talks about superpowers. It's one of our superpowers as architects. I love that term. But yeah. So I don't know what you think, Matthew. What do you think?
What do I think? I think I'm still like, and maybe this is the question for the panel, because I think I'm still trying to understand what spatial is as a term and as a category. I think the other categories are perhaps clear because they are defined through other media or other things. So a simulator, a graphic, and an object. They are kind of easily definable. Whereas I think spatial as a category, I could say that the way that we work is we work on all of these things together, and then somehow maybe we could point to either one and be like, oh yeah, that's spatial. But at the same time, I'm not really 100% certain what exactly that means. And maybe that's one thing for the panel to open up is what in our own work would we describe as spatial, or how would we kind of describe that quality in the way that either we produce and the way that we construct our images. Already, Mira was talking about sort of photographing and constructing our images through these sort of parallel planes to the picture plane, right? And thinking about that the parallel between the sort of the wall and the depth between the wall and the picture and the lens. And then Herwig was talking about video, where it seems like with video you have millions and millions and millions of frames, and so there's never one static moment to actually choose from. You actually have a million different, right? And so 5 videos, and you never have to settle for any one, right? And then Sumina, thinking about with yours, and just as somebody that works perhaps often in a similar way, when you're working digitally, you can move around your thing a million different ways, but then once you have to document something that is real in the world, you have to choose a set of specific images and vantage points in order to document it, and you end up over photographing the thing that you're doing, right? And so I'm sure you probably have something like 1 million different photographs of this pavilion. Right. And I can imagine the same thing for Margaret and John. It's just like the sheer number of interior photographs that you have of your projects. Right.
I don't think so. I think they know exactly the view.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that true?
I think so.
Well, usually, I mean, you have a photographer take way more than you need, and you edit them down, and then you just discard the things you don't know. But I don't know. I don't know if it's, I mean, look, we could talk about space and architecture and space, but I don't think, I think it may be more interesting to think about if this thing was redone and these groups were more understood. Like if you took everybody taking models and then blended it, or everybody taking interiors of something and then blended it, or exterior shots of buildings or drawings or two-dimensional artifacts, I think you'd end up with a very different thing. I think this was really ambitious in both the number of architects and their freedom of, submitting whatever, in my mind. So that when I see the results, while it's fascinating and interesting and it's a beautiful experiment. I see this whole thing as this really interesting experiment. But it's like you'd want to do it again, and you'd want to then maybe have some findings from this and then deploy it in another kind of way where maybe, I think it's interesting that afterwards these categories came through and they're loose, as Casey's admitting in the chat and saying, like we don't need to be, we're not called the new spatialists or something like this. Is, don't get caught in the labels. So I would shift the discussion maybe back a little bit, not about our individual work and how it's like shown in here. But more back to the topic, I think, of this experiment, and we're all just kind of part of it. And we could talk in our own terms about this stuff behind me and the stuff I'm seeing. But I think there's something larger going on, which is, what is an image today, and the amount of images. I mean, this discussion seems to focus on our personal work and how we're tied to those images. But I would argue that we don't even own those images anymore. And certainly when you build a thing, it's out and it's a background for, Instagram. It has its own life, the physical thing in the world. And the number of images and their just sheer volumes over the last 20 years has completely changed their worth in many ways. And I don't know, I think more and more maybe then we try to curate those images and try to re-own them in a way because we don't have much control of them, actually. And I think ultimately that's what this is showing me, this entire exhibit. It's like how we don't have any control, actually, of those images, and they have a life of their own, whether this is AI or collective kind of use and misuse through social media and other means. The understanding of ownership of a thing is very different right now, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also want to jump in because I think these whole images are actually also reflecting how we as architects or as photographers want to absorb and view our built environment and our pieces. And I think because it's not, as John was mentioning, maybe if we see like plans or sections, it would have been developed really new sets of drawings and architecture. But I think also Casey was chatting me about like that some of my contents was drone video. I completely forgot about it. Yeah, so it's not human perspective, but I think there are also, there will be some different kinds of like contents making of actual physical environment will also change, and the aesthetics of how you photograph things will also evolve. And I think that all kind of reflected in this kind of results. So I think it's kind of quite fascinating.
Maybe, I mean, I suppose the thing that is challenging to me in relationship both to the category that we've been placed in and also the larger project of the image collection and the processing of things is that spatial is perhaps the only category that's not shared by another field, right? It's not shared by graphic design. It's not shared by artists. Simulators are shared by other fields. Objects are shared by other fields. Spatial is something that we could probably say specifically, or even historically, like architectural, right? And that it does take working through this exhibit. It has meant that we'd have to process that quality through some other medium. So either through a photograph or through video. And I think that that's the thing that is maybe kind of interesting and challenging to me is what does that actually mean of kind of passing it through something else to get to the AI, to get to this things. And so I guess maybe opening that up to the group is like, and that I suppose that's why I keep like questioning, how do we define spatial? Because I think being able to define that is then it allows us to define it through these other mediums in order to communicate through this device.
I mean, I think maybe equally important question to that is like, we always have worked with images in architecture, right? I mean, interpreting images. And I think actually the discussion today was really fascinating in the sense that what was brought up a lot was like, this stuff is messing with the images we are so familiar with or opinionated about as being a certain kind of aesthetic. And it messes with that, right? And it does defamiliarize that. And what it actually, I think, and that's maybe where the potential lies in this, is also, it's kind of like it suggests something else, When I was listening to some of those descriptions, like Devyn was talking about that a little bit, and David in that discussion, I couldn't help remembering that when music notation changed from sheet notes to graphics, there was a period of that where it would become about interpreting what that means. And in a way, that's a very kind of both a interpretation, you could say it's a spatial interpretation of sounds, what they mean, how they're being generated, and how they are very loosely and interpretively match this kind of image, And so I think there's great potential there to kind of, maybe spatialize the image and looking at it, what it actually, its generative kind of like trajectory, what that could possibly mean. I mean, we in our work have been lately really interested in trying to figuring out how do you make a 2.5D or 3D out of an image that's generated by an AI, right? And why would you do that? And how would you do that? And how do you start looking about turning this into possibly a tectonic or a color or a different kind of materiality? So I do think there is that potential in terms of like using it as a tool, as a generative tool, but not as a kind of, here it's going to give me the design, but here it's going to give me something that I can use to generate or work with as a design tool. And I think as such, it has great potential, And I think the expectation of like, and this came up today too, is like, at some point, are we going to have powerful enough of an algorithm that's actually going to produce 3D content, which doesn't really exist right now, right? Produces a lot of like images, but doesn't really produce visual models of stuff. Or it can, but like they're quite primitive, you know. But maybe that's also besides the point. I think it's that's probably less interesting in this whole kind of discussion. But it's more like there's a practical aspect to the AI that has to do with technology, how it's going to change the world we live in. You know, from anything from self-driving cars to the way how we communicate, etc. But then there's also, I would argue, there is an aesthetic kind of like component to it. You know, especially if you're looking at it as something that you can corrupt, manipulate to start re-seeing something that you think you know exactly what it looks like. You know, and I think that to me is still has a lot of potency.
I thought what was interesting about a lot of the images that are creating is they almost feel like they have different ecologies, right? Like it feels part of the recognition part for me was like recognizing the particular ecologies when I could understand two things that were coming together, and it was almost. And for sure, it was more than just two coming together, but it almost always felt like you could only read two, right? Like probably it's like more morph than that, but you feel like there's ecologies of images when you look through all of them, and you can start to recognize in every single one of the videos. There's this ecology in that one, and then that same ecology shows up in the other one, but in a different way. That's what I find fascinating about.
It's something to me about that I'm really interested in what we're seeing also is, I don't put my finger on it, but it has something to do with the fact that like we submitted a bunch of images, but we actually are right now as an office working a lot more with video and with things that are moving. And even our, like John, you brought up the question of the status of the image. I think that even with the way that we teach our students right now, there's so many things that are really kind of surpass the image as something kind of stagnant and something that's really looking at things that are sort of moving or in an environment. And maybe kind of the question of ecology comes into that too, but like a kind of an atmosphere of something. So something that is not, the camera could be staying still, but there's a sense that things are moving, or there's sounds or a whole set of other things that are present. And I think the presentness and liveness is now moving, is the next thing beyond the image. I think that the image has been the sort of topic. And I think a much more full-bodied set of kind of more immersive set of conditions, whether it's, and you get that here in the thing that we're looking at, right, where it's not just a single frame, it's like the thing in motion. Of course, we could stop it and look at any individual thing and start to imagine what that is three-dimensionally. But I think what's also powerful about this stuff is the fact that it is in motion, and it does create the kind of heat of a place or whatever that is. Be it ecological or whatever that means, and I see that too, Margaret. And to me, that's actually is pointing more. I don't know if that's pointing more towards the real or more towards a new form of digital. I think probably both, or hybridization of that. But something that is that surpasses the sort of flatness of the preoccupation of flatness and the image construction. That I think that we've had for the last I don't know how long set of for in at least within SCI-Arc, the discourse around the image. I think that it's shifting, and I think it's asking things that have more of a pulse, be that simulated or imagined towards something real. And I think that the kind of pulse of what we're seeing I'm seeing behind me seems to also kind of have a flicker of that.
I think Liam said something interesting. He was saying, "What imagine you can talk to your city," you know, I mean, I think that's probably is going to be a reality, and that's a fascinating concept. Like that's a complex organism that you might be able to interact with and communicate with. The same with buildings. I think that there is definitely a component that's super interesting in terms of like how buildings are going to become more interactive with the environment, but also with the people. And that it's technology, but it's maybe also a different materiality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what Mira said about also this motion and changing kind of aspect of this result is really one of the really powerful things, because you can actually see how things are. It's a process of learning, as I understand, but we can actually see how things are blending from one to the other, and then we can decide where to pose it and appreciate it. And I think it's fundamentally not that different from what we have been using our digital tools or any tools for designing. And I think it's just a new tool that arrived to us. And there are, of course, like different ways of using it, but it's I think it's still in that kind of trajectory of design tools that can be used and tweaked and hacked into anything. And we as architects should really try to kind of proactively kind of find a meaningful way to use it, of course, in any kind of aspect, in also like by like talking to city, or by using it as a generative tools for inspiration or form generation or form making or anyhow. I think it's really super powerful and fascinating a future that we can actually just sneak peek here.
I would add one other thing about the categorizations. I mean, it would be, as I'm looking at all these images, I'm thinking about SCI-Arc, where we all teach, and the number of images that the school produces and the students produce, of course, artifacts as well as images and things. And for years we've been archiving student work in many different ways, and as we all know, when you try to think what is SCI-Arc, or what is what's going on at the school, is a tough question. It depends on what you've seen and when you were there and what reviews you were on and how long you spend in the school, and not really anyone really knows all of it and how much comes through. And now that it's almost 20 years I've been at the school, and thinking about the number of images that we have, it would be interesting to use some of these tools to start to sift through all of that work, to understand new categories, new adjacencies, new ways of understanding these images, and perhaps similarities where we didn't expect them, like a kind of the school to have its own kind of strange, not just archive, but way to search the archive, which would be highly special, maybe in some kind of way, and also then have more of it, because as we know, archives are highly edited, and things get lost and it's gone, and no one ever sees it again. Well, that's a new grant that Casey has to get.
I love that. I love the fact that the funny thing, because I did kind of listen also throughout here and there between dinner and all the other things, listening to the conversations which flowed over the last couple of hours, but how the conversations really existed, really moved between the sort of internal questions of aesthetics to very much about the real and about the way the kind of the politics of AI and what that means in our life right now, to things like you're just describing, John, like, well, what does it mean to just be able to have access to our own content, and what that mean to like build up a sort of way of understanding for our own culture internally, like as a school. And I think that to me is maybe the surprise. I think the thing that I've loved the most about the kind of conversation and about the project is the fact that it's relevance. Like it is deeply relevant. And I think that for me personally, I'm really interested in how do we really try and re-engage questions of relevance in our field. And I think that if that oftentimes ideas about relevance feel like they're really shored up by themselves, like, one's own individual conversation. But I think that what's interesting about this conversation throughout the night has been when, the kind of questions of energy output for all the data that's being stored, to kind of the ways it relates to cities and new forms of cities. Like these are kind of real things that are taking place. They may not be super visual aspects of how this technology is playing out, but I think that's something that's a really cool thing that has kind of emerged alongside of what is also a deeply aesthetic sort of preoccupation.
Mm-hmm. So I think I need to wrap us up for the night. We've already hit that 45-minute mark. So I want to thank everybody in the spatial group. I want to thank all of our panelists. And I also want to thank everybody for joining us.